Good morning and welcome to the 31st meeting of the Economy, Energy and Fair Work Committee for 2020. Apologies have been received from Gordon MacDonald, and I welcome John Mason, who's attending as a committee substitute. Item 1 on the agenda is a decision on taking business in private, a decision by the committee to take items 4, 5 and 6 in private, and whether a consideration of these items should be taken in private at future meetings. Are we agreed? Yes. Thank you. We now move to item 2 on the agenda, which is pre-budget scrutiny for 2021 to 22, regarding also the impact of COVID-19 on businesses, workers and the economy. And we have with us in the committee room today Jamie Hepburn, Minister for Business, Fair Work and Skills, and with him is Gavin Gray, who's Deputy Director for the Young Persons Guarantee. Online we have Colin Robertson, who's the Head of Skills Development Unit, and Norman MacLeod, Senior Principal. No, sorry. Apologies, I'm jumping onto the wrong sheet there. My mistake. I think we have, yes, we have Colin Robertson, Head of Skills Development Unit, and in fact, over the page, we have Amy Stewart of the Employability Division. My apologies. Now, I would welcome all of you this morning and invite the Minister to make a brief opening statement. Minister.
Thank you, Convener, and thank you to the committee for inviting me along to attend today. Convener, we all know that this global pandemic has created unprecedented challenges for businesses and individuals throughout Scotland. We acted quickly and we put in place a comprehensive package of measures worth over £2.3 billion to help sustain businesses. However, we are acutely aware of the disproportionate impact this pandemic can have on key priority groups, which is why our response has a key focus on supporting young people and those facing unemployment. We have a strong infrastructure already in place, including our developing the young workforce networks and a range of programmes already delivering for people who need it most. It's on those foundations that we must build as we steer our way through the difficult time to come. We've already committed an additional £100 million for employment support and training. Of this £100 million, £60 million has been committed to the Young Persons Guarantee, delivering the recommendations set out by Sandy Begbie in September, with £10 million invested in apprenticeships to help modern and graduate apprentices who are facing redundancy get back into work. And we'll increase support through our Partnership Action for Continuing Employment Scheme, and we will create a £25 million National Transition Training Fund launching in autumn to support people providing rapid, high quality and targeted support to those facing redundancy and unemployment in those sectors and regions most exposed to the current economic downturn. We've also increased funding for the Flexible Workforce Development Fund from £10 million to £20 million for this coming academic year, helping apprenticeship levy-paying employers upskill and reskill their existing workforce. And we continue to provide support for those who are unemployed or in work on incomes of £22,000 or less to access new skills focused on labour market progression through individual training accounts. I'm sure that all of the committee members appreciate the scale of the challenge we face, and we are keen to work collaboratively with all parties and all partners in our response to the pandemic. This will be important if we are to ultimately build back our economy in a fairer, greener and more sustainable way. And with that, Convener, I'm happy to field any questions the committee may have.
Thank you, Minister. And I think if you're bringing in either of your officials, or indeed any of the officials, the two online, Amy Stewart and Colin Robertson, perhaps if you could name those to assist the broadcasting to bring them in, should you wish to do that. And indeed, I think it's perhaps easier with the two of you that are in the room to bring your other official in as may be required. Now go to the Deputy Convener, who is, I think, online. Willie Coffey.
Yeah, good morning, Convener. Thank you very much. Good morning, Minister and the rest of the committee. A good place to start might be to talk about youth employment and unemployment in Scotland, which is of interest to the whole committee. Now, when you look at the last comparable economic shock to the economy, the recession in 2008, it took several years for youth unemployment levels to drop back to their pre-recession levels. Now, Minister, given that the UK government isn't having a budget this year with any specific measures to tackle youth unemployment, is there a danger that the same thing could happen again and we might see a peak in youth unemployment levels in Scotland?
Thank you, Deputy Convener, for that question. In relation to the overarching point, I suppose the first thing I would reflect on inevitably in any economic downturn, the effects might be felt for some time to come. I think that was particularly the case in the last economic downturn, which came around as a result, of course, through the crisis in the banks and the availability of capital for businesses to draw down upon, and business uncertainty that arose from there. We don't know that the economic response will be quite the same in this circumstance. Of course, it's a very different factor that's driving it, this time, of course, being the global pandemic. But the other thing I would reflect on as well is that in the 2008-2009 period, we had to create much of the infrastructure to respond to that particular economic crisis. So Skills Development Scotland was only really coming on line. We moved forward to create the Developing Young Workforce initiative. We put in raft a range of types of different training and employability provisions, such as the Employability Fund. And the good place that we're in this time by comparison is that infrastructure exists. So I go back to the point I made in my opening remark around us building on what we have just now. So that does place us in a stronger position. Undoubtedly, the decision of the UK government to delay its budget once again, it poses a challenge, a not insignificant challenge for the government in pulling together its budget proposition, and a not insignificant challenge for this Parliament to then consider that budget proposition. But that's the position we are unfortunately in, and we'll need to cope with that and deal with that. But certainly what we would be looking for through the UK government's budget is significant investment in the area of an economic stimulus and supporting people through this period of time. In terms of our own approach, of course, it's important to go back to the point that I made around building on what we have in place. We seek to learn from the last period, and that's why in 2018 we undertook a full review of our employability services. That's informed our approach through the No One Left Behind agenda. And if you look at one of the other new elements of the fairly new, comparatively new elements of our system, foundation apprenticeships, we've asked Education Scotland to review the experience of young people undertaking foundation apprenticeships. So we also seek to be informed by the practical experience of what went before, so we can continue to finesse it and improve it. But my estimation is that by comparison to the last period, we're in a better place to respond than we were in 2008 and 2009. And I'm hopeful that it will not take the same intervening period of time to get back to where we want to.
Youth unemployment in Scotland has consistently been lower than in the rest of the UK and indeed Europe. Do you put that down to some of these previous interventions that you've mentioned there? And looking ahead, do you see obviously us continuing with those types of intervention? And what kind of new measures can you foresee that might be required to assist and offer more opportunities for the particularly 16 to 24 age group in Scotland? Thank you.
Well, I go back to the point I've made around building on what we have in place, but the prism through which we want to do that is through the Young Persons Guarantee that we've committed to establishing. That came around as a response to the report of the advisory group on economic recovery, and also informed by the report of the subgroup of the Enterprise and Skills Strategic Board, who were looking at the types of skills and employability interventions we might need in the current and coming period. So that's why we've committed to taking forward the young person's guarantee to make sure that every young person aged 16 to 24 in Scotland is guaranteed that opportunity of work, education or training. Yes, that will use the provision of services and programmes that are in place, certainly, but what we need to do is enhance that, and that's why we've leveraged in some £60 million of investment specifically for the youth guarantee delivered through the partners we have. £30 million of that will go to local authorities to support the existing local partnerships, deliver employability support, £10 million to colleges, £10 million to support pre-apprenticeship activity, to try and support people, young people, into apprenticeships, and picking up again on that element. The element I think that's of critical importance and that's really informed Sandy Begbie's report, because he was involved in it himself, developing the young workforce. £10 million for the developing the young workforce activity to try and better embed that activity in the school environment through the provision of schools coordinators. So that's a significant investment. And of course also working with other provision the UK government's put in place its Kickstart Scheme. I think it would have been better if there'd been some involvement before the Kickstart Scheme was announced, so that it could be more aligned and more coordinated with what we're trying to do here in Scotland. But nonetheless, the UK government has put it in place, and it's important we recognise and try and make sure that that's factored into the equation as well, albeit through the prism of our ambitions for fair work. We've also got the ambition of seeing people paid the real living wage, and the Kickstart Scheme doesn't commit to that, so we need to think how we try and accentuate and enhance that provision as well.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Minister. Thank you, Convener. Back to you.
We have a supplementary from Maurice Golden.
Thank you, Convener. Just Willie Coffey suggested that the UK government didn't have any schemes focusing on youth unemployment, but as the Minister has just articulated, there is the Kickstart Scheme, which will create job placements for 16 to 24-year-olds. Is there any analysis that you've conducted to show the impact of that on the youth in Scotland?
We don't have any analysis at this stage, but what we have committed to doing, and go back to the point I made before, the Kickstart Scheme isn't probably precisely what it would look like if it was directly in our hands, but nonetheless it's a reality, it's there, and we seek to make sure that it is aligned and integrated in as much as it possibly can be, because it's not our scheme, but integrated within the concept of the young person's guarantee that we have established. I think that's an important point to make, Convener. The young person's guarantee covers a range of activity, the developing young workforce activity, apprenticeship activity, other forms of employability intervention, college and university activity, and of course, as we are discussing just now, the Kickstart Scheme, which isn't our scheme, but it's there, and we'll need to work with that, and we're already engaged with the DWP to try and make sure it aligns as much as possible, as I say, with our wider young person's guarantee, so that employers engage with it and engage with all of the activity we want to see taken forward through the prism of that guarantee.
Thanks.
Thank you. Richard Lyle.
Good morning, Minister. We all know the stress of finding or getting our first job, or even a job, after leaving school, college or university. So can I ask, Minister, have the Scottish Government statisticians produced any estimates showing how many 16 to 24-year-olds could be unemployed by the end of this year? And if so, do these show how different areas and sectors in Scotland are being impacted? And on top of what we are doing, is there anything else that we could do further to help, or are we doing enough?
So in terms of where we are with youth unemployment, we are already starting to see that impact here in Scotland. So the last labour market statistics showed it was around about 4% higher than the same period last year. In terms of the estimates as to where that could land at the end, we have had a range of estimates about the likely impact on employment levels overall. The most recent analysis I think I saw published suggested that this was from the Office of Chief Economic Advisor, of course, Mr Lyle, that indicated unemployment could be in the realms of around 8% by the end of the year, which is not what was initially the worst estimate. That was around about 13%, if I recall correctly. Now, that's across the labour market, that's across all age groups, and we know that young people are disproportionately impacted whenever there's any economic downturn. So I think the estimate that we have is it's somewhere in the region of, it could be around 60,000 additional young people into unemployment, and that behoves us to then intervene, and that's why we've responded. That's why we've put in place the young persons guarantee, which I've already discussed, but we also have acted quickly through our Developing Young Workforce groups, undertook a range of targeted activity for this year's cohort of summer leavers. We needed to respond quickly and immediately to try and engage with those young people who were leaving the school environment summer just past. So they undertook a range of activity, and in terms of the information we'll have and being able to track those who have left school through the data hub that SDS operate, we'll be able to see where 16 to 19-year-olds are in terms of employability, education and training, and seek to intervene and assist those young people who require that direct assistance through the Young Persons Guarantee.
So how confident are you that young people who have just left the education system during the summer are now in work or training? Are there any gaps? Have we left anyone behind?
Well, I've already made the point that youth unemployment is now higher, about 4% higher, according to the last labour market statistics, than it was at the equivalent point last year. So that is as a consequence of us already seeing the economic difficulties that we are facing as a consequence of the pandemic. So again, I go back to the point, that's why we have to intervene, that's why I have to intervene quickly, that's why we've put in place the youth guarantee, or the young persons guarantee, as we are now calling it, and we'll be making more information available about that in the coming period. But as I say, it will be very much built in the strong foundations we already have.
Are we looking at or are we predicting how many young people could be unemployed during the next 6 months? And are we sure that the money we are committed in all the good projects that you have announced today and other in previous weeks, are we seeking to ensure that youth unemployment is reduced?
Well, I'll go back to the point I've made around some of the estimates about the potential impact and the numbers in terms of young people who might be unemployed. I've already, of course, laid that out. In terms of the quantum we are investing through the Young Persons Guarantee, I think it's really important not to think of that as some form of budget allocation per young person who might be unemployed. That's really designed there to try and grease the wheels better of the system that we have already in place. It's designed to try and make sure that employers are properly engaged with the system we have in place. It's designed to make sure that we can maximise private sector investment, for example. And I go back to the point I made earlier, we're in a very different economic downturn than we were last time. So yes, we face economic uncertainty, but there are still employers with a raft of investment plans that they want to take forward, and we're trying to engage with them through the Young Persons Guarantee to make sure that young people can benefit by those opportunities. So in terms of the quantum of funding that we've allocated to the Young Persons Guarantee, that isn't the sum total of what will be invested in young people, of course. We've already got our investment through the tertiary education system. We've already got our investment that's in place through Skills Development Scotland. We've already got our investment that's in place through developing young workforce, albeit we're seeking to enhance all of these things in different ways. And we also want to work with the private sector to make sure that they're investing in young people too. And the positive thing to report back, Convener, is that despite the difficulties that we're facing right now, there are many employers across all sectors, private, public and third sectors, who are really up for responding to this challenge, who want to make a positive contribution to ensuring that young people can get into it and get ahead in the labour market.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. And Minister, on your last point, you talk about many businesses. Can you give us an idea of numbers and the scale of this and where we're at in terms of the numbers of young people that have come into the workforce since, say, March, when the current situation began in earnest, and how things have been working out in terms of employment?
So we know
and training.
Yeah. So we know young people are still entering the labour market, but again, I go back to the point, and there is no escaping the fact that we see a higher level of youth unemployment just now. In terms of some of the specific information that you're seeking, I think we need to look back and see if we could get an assessment of some of that through the information that Skills Development Scotland have. So I'm happy to commit to doing that and providing that to the committee if we can.
But you're not in a position to give the committee some sort of rough indication of figures today, are you?
In terms of young people who have entered the labour market over the last period of time?
Well, just in terms of how this all fits together, in terms of the numbers coming in, those who may have ceased to be employed, those who have gone into training and so forth. I appreciate exact numbers, figures you would have to come back to us on, but I'm just wondering if you can give us any...
I think I'd rather come back with exact and precise figures, Convener, so I'm happy to
all right, we'll look forward to receiving those then. John Mason.
Thanks very much, Convener. On the question of work experience, it's been suggested to us that young people are having difficulty getting work experience, and that can happen in different ways. It could be part-time work or voluntary work or whatever. Is it your feeling that there is a problem with young people getting work experience, and if so, can you suggest anything to address it?
So I think historically this has been a challenge which may well be exacerbated by the current period, but the provision of good quality, meaningful work-based learning and work experience for young people who are still in the school environment, or indeed those who have maybe not long out of the school environment, is something that we have had concerns about, and indeed that's what developing the young workforce has in many ways been about. So we task our developing young workforce regional groups with continuing to build the partnerships that they have with employers in their local area to ensure that they are providing opportunities for young people. I have been fortunate enough to be able to, not so much in the recent period, but over the last number of years, to be able to get out and about and meet many employers who have provided young people with such opportunities. And what we want to do is enhance that ability of developing young workforce infrastructure and our schools to engage with employers. And that's why we've responded positively to the suggestion that we provide DYW school coordinators across every secondary school in Scotland, building on the experience of having such an approach taken forward, piloted in Glasgow and Fife, so that we can better embed that experience. I mean, I suppose over the last period of time, inevitably that will become somewhat disrupted. Businesses, of course, in the immediate period have had to turn their attention to trying to look at their sustainability, and there'll have been, just by virtue of the restrictions that have had to be put in place, and a whole raft of economic activity and social activity that we're all still having to grapple with, the ability of an employer to bring a young person into their environment to give work experience has probably been somewhat limited by comparison to ordinary times. So as we move forward, we want to make sure that we're working with employers so that they can continue to provide those opportunities.
I mean, focusing on the schools, you've mentioned the schools coordinator, and maybe you could just explain how does the funding for that work? Is that additional to the school's existing staff, or has the school got to find some of the funding for that? And I mean, traditionally, as I've understood it, either in S4 or at some point, young people get a week out to get work experience, and we've taken them in our office, and I know other MSPs have as well. Is that really enough, do you think? I feel it's quite short.
No, I agree with that, and I suppose that goes... I mean, there's still a place for that, of course, but I think that reflects the point that I made about the substantial nature of a young person's experience, of work experience, and no, candidly, I don't think that really is probably as meaningful as we could otherwise make it be. So it's about trying to get employers engaged to commit to providing something more meaningful than that over a longer period of time. And many employers have committed to doing that through developing the young workforce. And the really positive thing, you know, a lot of them will engage on the basis, of course, that they want to give something back, want to provide young people that opportunity because they recognise it's important to do so. But actually I've met a whole raft of businesses and young people themselves who, through the provision of that work experience, have impressed the business, and they've gone on to offer them paid employment. And the way that I think we can enhance that raft of opportunities is through having dedicated resource within our school environment to make sure that those connections are being better embedded. So at the initial period of developing a young workforce, the idea was very much that within each school, the school themselves would dedicate resource from existing staff to try and coordinate some of that activity. And that has happened, and it has made a difference. But to try and take it to the next level, we've come to conclude, being informed by the experience in Glasgow and Fife, and certainly if you speak to Bob Garmery, who's the chair of DYW in the Fife area, he's raved about the approach and really pressed me on the necessity of the step we're taking of having school coordinators in our school environment. So to answer your initial part of your question, Mr Mason, yes, this is additional resource, and yes, this is dedicated resource towards that purpose.
Okay, thank you. And my final point would be, I mean, we've seen evidence that even before COVID, employers were taking fewer young people directly from education, presumably because they're also wanting experience. I mean, is that something that you're aware of or concerned about? Is it something that's inevitable, or is it something we can tackle?
Well, I think it's more of a concern in the current period. I mean, actually, if I recall correctly, I could be corrected on this, that the last progress report that we saw for developing young workforce set out that it's actually broadly remained stable in terms of recruitment direct from education from the baseline measure that we had in 2014. My concern is more around the current period and whether or not, without any form of intervention, that might worsen that position, might weaken. And that's why, of course, we have put in place the response we have through the Young Persons Guarantee, but it's also why the activity of developing young workforce remains important, and indeed they've been active over the recent period. Over the summer period, there was the DYW Skills Academy, which was a 5-week programme to provide insight, skills and knowledge to help young people build in their industry readiness. There was the first ever virtual parents events to try and make, because we know that having informed parents or carers is critical in terms of making sure young people are informed about their options. So there was an event for them, and also was DYW Up to You, which was a virtual careers week, which involved employers and young people, letting them know about the range of opportunities there are. I mean, these are things that would ordinarily be happening on the ground, and ordinarily there's a whole raft of activity happening within each area, very impressive activity happening within each area, being led by the DYW groups. But they have continued their work even in difficult times and in more constrained circumstances that have inhibited their ability to do things in the usual fashion. So we've responded with the Young Persons Guarantee. We're responding by ensuring that there's investment to create pathways into apprenticeships for young people, and also investment to try and retain existing apprentices and the people who give their time through developing young workforce, most of them volunteering their time incidentally, and I think that should be placed on the record, because I'm eternally grateful that they give that time. But those people involved in DYW also undertaking activity as an immediate response to COVID-19.
Thanks very much.
Colin Beattie, who joins us remotely.
Thank you, Convener. I'd like to focus a little bit on modern apprenticeships. We've seen a fairly dramatic drop of around 80% in starts over the past 7 months. What is the Scottish Government doing to actually directly impact on that worrying figure?
Well, the first thing I would say is that I think we would all be worried about the figures that were reported in Q1. There was a very dramatic decline in the number of new apprenticeship starts. I think that goes back to the point I've just made to Mr Mason, just as it would be difficult for employers to facilitate work experience in the work environment. There was the challenge probably of facilitating formal work-based learning through apprenticeships, and also just in that immediate period. And we shouldn't forget that an apprentice is an employee, it's a paid position. Just in that immediate period, I think businesses' priorities shifted and they were recruiting less people into apprenticeships, very clearly demonstrated by the figures. That's the Q1 figure. We will we'll get a clearer picture when the Q2 statistics are published, which will be next month. I'll be candid, I'm expecting improvement from Q1, but I'm not expecting it to match where we were at Q2 last year. I think if I was to make that claim, I don't think anyone would believe me, so I'm not going to make that claim. There is significant disruption to apprenticeships and apprenticeship starts at this moment in time. We have asked Skills Development Scotland to try and undertake some detailed modelling on what we can expect. It's obviously very difficult for them to do that because it's a demand-led programme. It requires employers to want to employ apprentices. That's not to say we don't sit back and we're passive about it. Through SDS, through our network of training providers, we are proactive in promoting the benefits of apprenticeships, and I've already referred to some of the activity that we're undertaking to support better pathways into apprenticeships. So it remains an important part of our offer, but there's no doubting that we have seen disruption to the number of starts that we might have otherwise expected if we hadn't faced a global pandemic, which is disappointing. Since 2007, this government has delivered over or supported through public funding over 300,000 apprenticeships. Since I had policy responsibility for this area, we've met our target each and every year. We set ourselves a target of 29,000 apprenticeship starts last year, and we passed that target. We hit that target. This year we had a target of 30,000, and we're doing everything we can to get as close to that as possible. But in the current situation, I think it would be safe to say it's going to be very difficult to see the achievement of the target that we had set ourselves, which I have every confidence if we hadn't been in this period, we would have done, just as we've done in last year, the year before that, and the year before that.
Minister, you have touched on targets for modern apprenticeships, but can I take it from what you're saying that there is no revised target at this point for modern apprenticeship starts?
That's correct. We've not revised our target. I'm just being candid and open with the committee that, given the disruption we saw at Q1, we will, as I say, have a clearer picture as to where we are when the Q2 figures are published next month. But just being candid and open with the committee, I think the achievement of 30,000 this year is unlikely, but we've not revised our target at this stage, and whether or not we set a formal revision of any target, we're certainly asking SDS to undertake the work to see what might be a more realistic proposition for this year. But I don't want the committee to have any sense that apprenticeships don't remain of fundamental importance to the Scottish Government, to SDS. They absolutely do. And we are taking every effort we can to continue to promote the benefits of them to employers and to see as many employers as possible take on as many apprentices as possible. But being realistic about it, given the interruption we've seen at Q1, then there's no pretending that we're not going to face challenges here.
Minister, some current apprentices may have some concerns around the future of their apprenticeship. Can you give them any reassurances that, you know, they will not suddenly be terminated in the middle of this?
So we already have a very effective system in place through our Adopt an Apprentice scheme. Even out with this period of time, it's not unknown. It's unusual, thankfully, but it's not unknown for apprentices to be made redundant by an individual employer. And what happens then is through the interaction of that apprentices training provider with Skills Development Scotland, the Adopt an Apprentice programme is triggered and through a one-off financial incentive provided to another employer, that's designed to try and make sure that that apprentice can complete their apprenticeship. The last thing we want to see, and the last thing I think anyone would want to see, is a person having to give up their apprenticeship halfway through the period of training because they've lost their employment. So we have that system in place, but and incidentally, we've also extended that scheme to graduate apprentices from February of this year. They're also eligible alongside modern apprentices as well. But in the current period, we've also recognised we need to do more. So we have leveraged in and repurposed some of the funding that was within Skills Development Scotland to try and make sure that we are taking every effort to work with employers so that they see the benefits of retaining their apprentices that are employed with them. But if that can't happen, then Adopt an Apprentice kicks in, and that it will do everything it can to make sure that that apprentice is placed into an alternative employer and can finish their apprenticeship. And actually, it has a very high level of success rate. If the committee wants, we can provide figures to demonstrate that.
It would certainly be interesting to see these figures, Minister, because obviously there's a great concern as to the number of modern apprentices that may have lost the opportunity to complete their apprenticeship with their current employer. And I suppose the concern is, are there enough resources to be able to pick these people up and make sure they get through to the end of a very important part of their training?
Well, on the latter point, yes, there is, and hopefully I've demonstrated that, and yes, we're leveraging in more. I've obviously committed to seeing what specific information we can provide around the impact on young people. I said that in response to the convener, and I'll make sure that we do that. One of the things I think we could probably more readily provide, although I don't have the figure to hand just now, Convener, but we can establish how many apprentices have actually been made redundant in the current period. From engaging with employers, my estimation is that actually more often than not they seek to try and protect the apprentices they have employed with them, not least because the reason they take on apprentices is it's forward planning, it's succession planning. They recognise that a cohort of their workforce is going to leave them at some stage, and they must have a new pipeline of talent for them as an individual employer for future years. So they actually take every effort to try and protect apprentices. But we can provide more formal figures if that's something that would be helpful for the committee.
Thank you, Convener.
Well, Minister, that would be very helpful to have those figures. But I suppose what people are interested in is what would you say is the key thing that you're doing in this area, in light of the fairly drastic measures that have been imposed as a result of COVID regulations and the effects on businesses and apprenticeships? What would you say is the key thing that you're doing?
Well, I think it goes back to the point I've just made, Convener. So if we're talking about apprentices who are currently employed, we've leveraged in significant additional resource for Skills Development Scotland to work with and interact with the employers who currently employ them to make sure that they are retained in employment. If, for whatever reason, there are some impacted by redundancy, then the Adopt an Apprentice scheme kicks in. And if you're talking more generally in the realms of recruitment, that's going to be a core part of the youth guarantee. So it's the process of engaging with employers to work out what their plans are in terms of recruitment and make sure that apprenticeships are embedded in as part of that. So that activity is very much a key focus of the young person's guarantee and continues to be taken forward through all of the various elements of that I've spoken about, through developing the young workforce, through Skills Development Scotland's core activity, and through the variety of means of engagement that we have with employers. So again, for example, Scottish Enterprise have a role to play here as well when they are interacting with individual account managed companies. They will also talk about the range of opportunities that might be available through the public purse to support the training of people in the workplace, including apprentices. So it's a whole system approach, and that's in place. And what we're seeking to do is enhance that through the additional resource that we've deployed that I've already spoken about.
All right, Alison Harris.
Good morning, Minister. I would like to look at the MA programme, and due to an 80% drop in starts, less money is being spent on the training element in this MA programme. So where will this money or this budget be allocated? Where will it move to?
So effectively, that goes back to the point I've already made around us working with Skills Development Scotland to respond to the current circumstances. So effectively, that's been deployed in Adopt an Apprentice, a transition programme for redundant apprentices. I've already mentioned the Pathways to Apprenticeships, which is working with specific sectors. The construction sector we've already been engaged with, working with other sectors in business services, engineering, childcare, IT, digital software, IT digital hardware. So I guess if the core question is, is this money going to stay in the realms of apprenticeships and training provision? The short answer is yes, that's what we're seeking to do. It just has to be responsive to the circumstances we're in. So if there are fewer opportunities for people in the labour market taken on as apprentices, the question incumbent on us is then, well, what do we do alternatively to utilise the expertise of Skills Development Scotland to work with our training providers, to work with our educational institutions, to support people in a different way. And again, that's a core part of the young person's guarantee, but also other things that we've not touched on yet, such as the National Transition Training Fund, which is designed for those who are aged 25 or older, who might be impacted by the difficulties we may see in the labour market, support them to get back into employment as quickly as possible as well, through meaningful, purposeful skills and training interventions. So effectively it's about looking at where we are and responding accordingly, and that's what we've sought to do through the work that was undertaken through the advisory group on economic recovery, the work that was undertaken through the Enterprise and Skills Strategic Board subgroup, which was looking at skills and employability, which made a raft of recommendations which we are now articulating into practical action. The Young Person's Guarantee being one such example, the National Training Transition Fund being another such example, and a lot of that's predicated on saying, you know, we've budgeted for certain types of activity through, in this instance, Skills Development Scotland. Much of that activity is not going to be realised, so how do we use that resource differently and more flexibly? And that's what we're committed to doing.
Okay, thank you, Minister. If we look at college funding, will an expansion of college capacity be a priority for the forthcoming budget?
Well, actually, if you look at where we are in this current year through the prism of my own area of responsibility, I already mentioned the increase to the Flexible Workforce Development Fund, so that's already led to additional resource going to the college sector, who have demonstrated that they've really responded to the challenge of supporting those who pay the UK Government's apprenticeship levy to ensure that their existing workforce can get some form of training that suits their requirements. We're also thinking through how we might build on the success of that programme and make it further flexible still. And if I go back to the Young Person's Guarantee, some £10 million of that is going to be directed towards colleges, and working very closely with the Scottish Funding Council and colleges as exactly as to how they might utilise that to make sure that they are responding to the challenges that we're in. But in terms of the question in the round and overall, then of course we will be looking very carefully at what our college system can do in response to the period that we're going to be in, and for the coming budget we'll consider that very carefully and allocate resource accordingly.
Thank you, Convener.
Minister, we heard from businesses that they are not in a position, some of them certainly, to take on new people this year. Is that something that you're factoring in? I appreciate that the rules, regulations, the situation we all face may change or is changing. I'm just wondering if you have a comment to make on that particular point. The businesses say they simply don't have the facilities or the ability or the need or the possibility to take on new apprentices going forward, as opposed to those that already have them, the way things look at the minute.
Well, yes, I mean, I'll go back to the point I've made around the resource that we're deploying, the engagement that we're having to try and incentivise and look at how we might support employers to take on young people and give them opportunities in work. We're looking at a variety of things we can do in that regard. One of the things that was recommended was a specific recruitment incentive for employers. We're considering carefully how that might be deployed. That approach isn't entirely new. There's been support for that through the Scotland's Employer Recruitment Incentive, which was in place, which is now part of the No One Left Behind strategy. Many local authorities still implement and operate an incentive, a financial incentive for employers to recruit young people. through the Community Jobs Scotland programme, which continues. There is also a similar form of incentive, and we're now looking more widely at how we could potentially adopt that for the recruitment of apprentices as well. So that's something that was recommended out of the advisory group on economic recovery, and it's something that Sandy Begbie has looked at through his activity in terms of framing what a young person's guarantee might look like. So we're discussing that through with Skills Development Scotland as to what that precisely might look like. We need to be careful with it, of course, Convener, because we don't want that to displace recruitment or replace, I suppose, recruitment that might have otherwise happened anyway. And that is still happening. There are still opportunities there. And I go back to the point I made earlier that we need to engage with employers to make sure that where they are taking people on, they are actively considering that some of those opportunities could be provided through apprenticeship opportunities. But, you know, on a general basis, I'm engaged with businesses regularly, and you know, I'll have open dialogue about some of the challenges that they might be facing, and always willing to listen as to what we could do differently and be creative about how we can work with them to make sure that they are providing more opportunities for young people. One thing that's happening right now is a weekly call with the business organisations, usually with Scottish Government officials, but I take part in that on a regular basis so that we can discuss some of these matters. Sandy Begbie has spoken with that group, and I also, as you would expect me as the Minister for Business, speak with those business organisations on a regular basis. And over the last number of weeks and months, I've been engaging directly with individual chambers of commerce, with individual members of the Institute of Directors, with members of the Federation of Small Businesses, to discuss a raft of matters, and of course this falls into that territory.
All right, Maurice Golden.
Thank you, Convener. Minister, I wonder if you could highlight some of the learnings from the previous Transition Training Fund.
So clearly it's important that we do that, because one of the things we have, and we haven't discussed much yet, is the National Transition Training Fund that we're seeking to put in place. The previous approach obviously was sector specific. That was for oil and gas specifically. There were around 4,000 applications approved through the Transition Training Fund that was in place for the oil and gas sector. The overwhelming majority of those who took part reported that the support they'd received had helped them get a job and improved their job security. So certainly there's a lot of positive things that we can learn from there. It enabled people to transition to other sectors, skilled trades, renewables sector, as you might expect. We saw a lot of people to transition to that sector. But also things that didn't work quite as had been hoped for. One of the challenges that we know we face is in logistics. It's something I've been able to discuss with the Road Haulage Association and hauliers in the past, and there was a specific element of that fund designed to try and recruit people into that sector, which didn't work quite as well. So we also need to be prepared to learn from what hasn't worked. So we are informed by the previous experience. Of course, what we are seeking to do here is in many ways much wider than the approach that we took in relation to the downturn that we saw in oil and gas. How could it be anything but wider? Because we know that this is going to impact a much wider range of sectors, a much wider geography. So that's why we're leveraging in more resource into this fund, and it's why we're also thinking through the specific types of sector that should be supported. So we're already thinking it through in terms of our ambitions around improved energy efficiency. We're already looking at it through the prism of digital skills. Of course, the Cabinet Secretary for Finance commissioned Mark Logan to publish his report, and a significant element of that was to do with the skills base in that sector. We're also looking at nature and land-based jobs and skills. Tourism. Tourism, of course, has been hard hit in the current period, so it's incumbent on us to think how we support people to transition from that sector, but also looking ahead into that sector as well. And social care, of course, is an important area for us as well. So we're thinking through very clearly the types of sectors that are the key priorities to get people into. And I think that's an important point to make, not just in relation to the Transition Training Fund, but more generally across our employability and skills system. And this was something we'd already set our task to through the Future Skills Action Plan, trying to make sure that where any person interacts with the employability and skills system, that it is very much directed with the outcome of them getting a form of skills intervention that will put them in a good place, a good position to get ahead in the labour market when they come out the other end. There's no use in providing people with a skill set that has no relevance for the future economy. I think we'd all agree with that. It has to be very much fixed on our future society and our future economy, and that's what we are very much trying to do through the National Transition Training Fund that we've established. But yes, informed very much by the previous Transition Training Fund as well.
Thank you, Minister. Just thinking about the greener recovery more generally, how much of an issue is the hollowing out of the labour market?
Well, it is a challenge, and whenever anyone falls out of the labour market, we know that if they are out of the labour market for a significant period of time, it can be more difficult to get them back into employment. That's just a general point. And if we are committed to, as we are, to having a green recovery, and going back to the point I've just made about having a very clear focus on that as an element of activity through the National Transition Training Fund, then we need to try and make sure that we are getting people back into employment as quickly as possible. So it is, of course, a concern, and that's why we're seeking to respond quickly. That's why we're seeking to put in place initiatives that are designed to try and make sure that we get people back into employment as quickly as possible, but make sure it's focused on our needs. And the activity, of course, of the Just Transition Commission has had a significant focus on the labour market and the provision of the type of skills that will be required to that end. We've also committed to publishing a skills action plan looking at climate change, which I'll be involved in taking forward, which candidly has, as with so much of government activity, been disrupted by responding to the current period that we are in. But that will be a very important part of my focus going forward as well.
Thanks, but I was mainly focused on the potential hollowing out of the labour market and how much that is, you know, the Minister's articulated more generally getting people into work, but I'm concerned about going forward that hollowing out of the labour market, you know, with increased digitisation and you know, what you're looking at in terms of how much of that is a concern and what you might be doing to address that.
Well, what we're trying to do to address it is the raft of provision I've laid out. So, candidly, I thought my answer was to the last question is effectively the answer to the question you've just asked me again, Mr. Golden. If you think there's something missing, then please feel free to be more specific, and I'll do my best to respond.
Well, I think I was more specifically those middle management jobs, for want of a better word, and just if there's anything. I mean, this is a global issue in terms of the labour market, and while we've been discussing how people to get to entry level, just I was looking for more what you're looking, how much of an issue you feel that is for the Scottish economy.
Well, it is an issue for the Scottish economy. It's not just an issue, as you rightly point out, it's an issue across all developed economies. I suppose maybe I've not been clear enough when I say people transition into other sectors. It's not necessarily at entry level. They come with an established skill set as well. And it's trying to make sure that that those elements that are transferable can be deployed. So if you've got a really good managerial skill set in one sector, then it may still be applicable in another sector, but you just have to acquire some of the understanding and knowledge around that particular area. So in the activity that we're seeking to take forward, it isn't all about entry level, particularly the National Transition Training Fund. That's for those who are aged 25 and over. And again, we've not mentioned thus far, but our individual training accounts, albeit a much smaller quantum of funding, is also designed for similar purpose, about progression in the labour market, and the overwhelming majority of people who take part in that are aged, I think, 35 or older. So these are people who are established in the labour market, who in many instances will have got to a certain place in within whatever organisation they're employed in, and if they then find themselves being displaced and out of employment, what we want to do is try and engage with them quickly, make sure that they can get a new, probably short, sharp form of skills intervention, but don't forget all the skills, the talents, the attributes that they have built up through their working lives. The term that's being deployed increasingly, it's not one I particularly like, but it's one that seems to be getting bandied about and used, as the meta skills that people have in terms of being able to have that transferable skill set around adaptability and applied learning in the workplace. Take that with you into your new workplace. So it's if you've been a manager in another organisation, then I'm not saying we can guarantee every person will then be able to get an equivalent managerial level role in another organisation, but they should be able to take the skill set that they've had and apply that in a new workplace, but supplemented with specific sector skills through the provision of new training. That's my ambition.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Convener.
Now we have Rhoda Grant, who joins us remotely.
Thank you, Convener. Can I ask what engagement the Minister's had with businesses, local government and the third sector on how the Youth Guarantee Scheme will be delivered? What's the time frame for this, and has he decided who will deliver it?
Could Ms Grant just repeat the last few words? I didn't quite hear the last bit of her sentence.
Yeah, so you heard a bit about discussions with local government, third sector and business?
Yeah.
Basically, what's the discussions with them? And have you decided who will deliver the Youth Guarantee Scheme and when it will be delivered?
Okay, so it was
the time frame?
It was the who will deliver, but I didn't hear. I mean, in terms of my engagement with business, I've already made the point. It is extensive, and we discuss a number of matters, but of late, as you can imagine, the young person guarantee has been preeminent amongst the issues that we've discussed. I've discussed that on a collective basis with the business organisations. I've discussed it on an individual, one-to-one basis with the business organisations, and I've also discussed it with businesses at a local level through the network of chambers of commerce. I also engage with the SCVO on a very regular basis. They are a critical partner in terms of engaging with young people who might be fairly disenfranchised from the labour market already, in terms of getting them into employment. So I have spoken with Anna Fowley, who of course is the Chief Executive of SCVO, on more than one occasion about these matters and the implications of the the Young Persons Guarantee and our No One Left Behind agenda more widely. And I meet with Councillor Kelly Parry, who is the COSLA spokesperson for this type of area of activity. I meet with her to discuss the No One Left Behind agenda as well. And of course Sandy Begbie, who has been instrumental in the taking forward the concept of a Young Persons Guarantee and developing what that might look like, has engaged with a whole host of different partners. He's engaged with I think every political party represented in the Scottish Parliament. He's engaged with those who, and I'll come to delivery partners in a moment, which was the last element of Ms Grant's question, but he's engaged with those who, as you would expect, would deliver the elements of the Young Persons Guarantees. Engaged with employers, he's engaged with unions. He's had wide engagement on these matters. In terms of who will deliver the Young Persons Guarantee, I mean, hopefully I was clear at the outset in some of the earlier questioning that effectively the Youth Guarantee encompasses and builds on that wide range of activity that is in pre-existence, but it seeks to enhance that and act as a portal for people into existing provision. So you will see a range of different parties involved. Local government has a very clear role. Our college sector has a very clear role. Our Developing Young Workforce Network has a very clear role. Skills Development Scotland has a clear role, working with our network of training providers, all of whom have to engage with employers to make sure that we're actively engaged with those who will provide the opportunities. And as I said earlier, although it's not a creature of our creation, and although it might not look exactly as it might have if we'd been involved earlier or it was our own programme, we're also seeking to make sure that the Kickstart Scheme can interact appropriately and effectively with our ambitions for the Young Persons Guarantee as well.
Okay, just going to push you on that slightly. The way you're speaking makes me think that the Youth Guarantee is going to be an extension of current schemes rather than a new scheme in its own right. Is that right? And if so, given we've heard about numbers of apprenticeships falling and indeed most of the current schemes falling, how do you get businesses involved? We've heard from businesses that there needs to be incentives there, both financial and that it becomes worth their while and that it lasts long enough. If it's simply an extension of current schemes, you know, are we, you know, does it need a name of its own at all?
I disagree with that last point, actually, because I think what we need to do is try and make sure that there's effectively, because one of the things I will hear frequently from employers is that the landscape of provision can be quite complex. So I think having something that's very obviously branded as Young Person Guarantee can go a long way in helping in that regard. In terms of, I guess I would describe it as accentuating and building on the system we have under the badge of the Young Persons Guarantee. And some of the very points that have been raised with you as areas of concern or opportunities by the business community are, as I've already indicated, things that we're actively looking at and considering. So Ms Grant mentions the idea of incentives to recruit young people. That's something we're looking at right now. So that's why I think a Young Persons Guarantee is important, because that additional resource will enable us to be in a better place to realise some of those ambitions.
And can I just come back briefly on that? So what you're saying is that there is no new scheme, but what the youth guarantee is to look at incentivising current schemes to try and increase the take-up that's dropped off.
To an extent, that's correct. But you know, the landscape we're in has changed drastically, so these things will have to operate flexibly and be responsive to the circumstances we're in. And some elements of it are new. I go back to the point I made earlier. You know, Kickstart is now in place. That's a new scheme, and okay, it's not our scheme, but it's there, and we better make sure that it pulls in the same direction as the rest of the provision we have on the ground. So, you know, to an extent, I would concur with the points that you're making, Ms Grant, but we are putting in additional resource so that we can build on what we have, accentuate it, and drive participation in the programmes we have in place. So you wouldn't, it shouldn't be a surprise, for example, as part of a young person's guarantee, you know, apprenticeships are part of that. Apprenticeships aren't new, and we're not creating an entire new system for the delivery of apprenticeships, but nonetheless, they are wrapped up and part of the young person's guarantee. I mean, at its core, the young person's guarantee is to do exactly as what it says. It's to guarantee a young person the experience of employment, education or training. That doesn't require us to create an entire new system, but it does require us to think how we maximise the benefit of the existing system that we have. And I think approaching that through the prism of something designed and badged as a young person's guarantee is an important step in that regard.
I'll hand back to the convener.
Andy Whiteman.
Thanks very much, Convener. Following on a little bit from what Rhoda Grant was saying, the committee, as you may be aware, has been engaging with young people in relationship to how they see their future in the context of the pandemic. And they've told us, for example, they want to see student accommodation made cheaper, they want to see national programmes to gain practical skills, they want debt relief for students who are out of work over summer, quite a lot of stuff that young people are looking at. And what struck us is the extent to which they are aware, engaged and interested in how to shape their own future. So can I just ask you, how much engagement are you having with young people in terms of the design of the scheme? Because of course it is a guarantee, as you've said, and that does involve existing programmes being wrapped up in that. But there's a lot more to what young people have said about their economic prospects than just education, work or training. And I note from Sandy Begbie's report that he says that it's important that among the next steps are to continue to engage and re-engage with key stakeholders to test the recommendations. But among the stakeholders he talks about in Appendix 1, it's just lots of institutions. Mm-hmm. So what's the government doing to maintain an ongoing engagement with young people to maximise the chances of this guarantee and other work the government's doing being successful?
So, I mean, this is something I think is of the utmost importance, and it's not a new approach to us. So, in taking forward the Developing the Young Workforce initiative, we've continued to articulate the importance of each regional group having the direct involvement of young people in the learner journey review. We work with a range of young people to hear directly from them what their experience of the education system has been. And in the taking forward of the Young Person's Guarantee, Sandy Begbie, along with Fiona Hislop, met directly with a panel of young people to hear from them as to what their experience has been and what their expectations would be from any Young Person's Guarantee. And that continues to be important. So what we have done is we've provided funding to Young Scot, who are, by my estimation, I think by most people's estimation, very effective and good at ensuring that we engage with a wide range of young people from a whole host of different backgrounds to work with young people so that they can directly inform the development of the Young Person's Guarantee moving forward. So it's important, and there have been a number of questions about us hearing the voice of business. Of course, that's of paramount importance because they will provide the opportunities, and we have to hear about the practical implications for them and what practical support we can put in place. But equally, we also have to hear from young people as to the types of things that they think would be helpful. Now, you've proffered a number of suggestions that have arisen out of conversation with young people. These are things we will always take away and consider, but the very purpose of the provision of funding to Young Scot is to have that type of meaningful engagement so that young people's voices can be at the core of what we do. And it's not just Young Scot that we've engaged with. We engaged with Apprentices Trust and Bernardo's, who equally have been able to facilitate engagement with young people as well, and young people who might be considered to have experienced a range of challenges in their lives that we really must consider if we're going to make sure that every young person benefits by our approach.
So the main route for engaging young people is through these intermediaries, which I don't doubt is a very valuable approach. I'm just seeking some reassurance that you are satisfied and doing all you can to make sure that the approaches they adopt are capturing the range of experiences. You've mentioned young people from care, for example, obviously a very, very important group, but you're capturing the whole range of experiences that you need to make sure that on an ongoing basis, this job guarantee continues to be designed in a way that reflects young people's priorities. I mean,
you speak to Mr Whiteman as the eternal challenge all of us as policymakers face in reaching out to as wide a range of people as possible. Insofar as I can be satisfied that we're working with the right intermediaries, and I think inevitably you have to work with the intermediaries who have the most direct contact with the people that you want to speak with, in this case, young people. In the case of some of the organisations, specific cohorts of young people, then I'm satisfied we're talking to the right intermediaries. Will we reach every single young person or a representative of every cohort of single young person? It would be remiss of me to absolutely guarantee yes, we will. But that's the eternal challenge and take forward any area of policy, isn't it? Who is it we're not speaking to? Well, sometimes it can be difficult to know, but the ambition is to engage with as wide a range of young people as possible.
Okay, thanks.
All right, thank you very much. If there are no further questions from committee members, I'll thank the Minister and his team for coming in today. Thank you. And we will, or rather, I will suspend the meeting before we move on to the next panel. Welcome back to this morning's committee meeting. We are now on item 3 of the agenda, and we're joined by Paul Wheelhouse, Minister for Energy, Connectivity and the Islands, so welcome to you, and also by a member of his team, James Hemphill, Heat Networks Team Leader, and remotely Gareth Fenney, Head of Heat Strategy, Ursula Kasperek, who is a Senior Policy Advisor, and Norman MacLeod, Senior Principal Legal Officer. So good morning to all of you. Now, Minister, perhaps I think you are to do a very brief opening statement, so I'll hand over to you at this stage.
Thank you very much, Convener, and thank you, Committee, for giving me the opportunity to reiterate the Government's thinking behind the bill and to begin to respond to the issues that have arisen in written and oral evidence to the Committee over the last few months. Put simply, the bill's primary purpose is to accelerate the development of heat networks in Scotland in order to help drive down emissions and to tackle fuel poverty, whilst providing some protection to users of these networks, notwithstanding the limits on our powers. The bill seeks to do this by creating a new licensing regime to ensure operators are solvent and fit and proper persons, establishing a new process for consenting, zoning and permitting to ensure that networks are developed where they will have most benefit, are tailored to the needs of an area, as well as providing certainty for long-term investment. Levelling the playing field with other utilities by creating new infrastructure rights for heat network developers and operators, and finally by putting in place arrangements to protect network users by enabling a transfer of operational rights to occur to ensure sustained supply. The bill, as introduced, was informed by extensive consultation, the recommendations of an expert working group of stakeholders, and engagement with communities, including on Scotland's islands. I'm keen to maintain this collaborative approach with stakeholders as the bill progresses through the Parliament, and look forward to working with the committee to secure passage of the bill, one that I hope the committee will agree is important for Scotland's future. The bill also responds to a very clear recommendation from the Competition and Markets Authority that regulation is now needed. As has already been recognised by the committee, there are limits on what we can do in Scotland, particularly with respect to consumer protection, which remains reserved to the UK Government. As I've mentioned, the bill already provides some safeguards, but as I set out in the accompanying documents, I'm working with the UK Government to secure the powers needed to implement comprehensive consumer standards in Scotland. With that in mind, I can confirm to the committee that I've today written to Kwasi Kwarteng, Minister for Business, Energy and Clean Growth at BEIS, with a proposed solution. We have listened to the calls for more explicit requirements around fuel poverty and on the role for local authorities in consenting new heat networks. In advance of stage 2, I can confirm to the committee that I will look seriously at these issues and consider how we can ensure a more explicit focus on fuel poverty, as well as ensuring that we strike the right balance for local authorities and ensure that they have the right powers to drive forward heat network developments in their areas. The bill will be transformational for the heat networks market in Scotland, but it is but one piece of the puzzle. There are other actions needed to grow the heat network sector in Scotland, including strengthening wider policy frameworks, as well as ensuring there is financial and project support available to help schemes get over the line. And to do this successfully, while ensuring that the bill is delivered safely and on time, I'm happy to work with committee members to consider non-legislative solutions to these wider issues, so that we can put in place strong foundations from which the sector can build. I will stop there, as I'm sure the committee will have a lot of questions for me, Convener. As always, I'll endeavour to answer them in what I hope you'll find will be a helpful manner, but please do let me know at any point if supplementary written evidence would be useful. So, Convener, I look forward to working with you and the committee as the bill progresses and to answering your questions this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. I've asked a number of witnesses to the committee, and they've all agreed that the definition of heat networks and the definitions in the bill are adequate both for current technologies and going into the future. And I'm presuming that you will agree with that viewpoint. So I'm just wondering if you could explain why, with reference to the provisions of the bill, that is the case.
Certainly, Convener, and it is important that any definition is clear on who the regulation will apply to, but it's also important that it has the capacity to capture both existing and emerging technology and infrastructure, as you indicate, Convener. We believe the definition at introduction does this, and I note that of the 23 responses to the committee's call for evidence that commented on the definition, 16 indicated that they broadly agreed with the current definition, although I recognise there are some caveats within those responses. The bill is not the only place, of course, where heat networks are defined in law. A definition is also provided for in the Heat Network Metering and Billing Regulations 2014. The definition proposed within the Heat Network Scotland Bill aligns with this definition in order to avoid confusion for operators about which legislation applies to them and provide for a clear regulatory framework. In terms of keeping up to date with technology as it develops, I certainly recognise that the definition doesn't explicitly reference ambient or shared loop systems, which I know has come up in evidence to the committee. We anticipate more of these networks in future, and the warrant regulation currently drafted allows for this. Should the definition need to be amended in future, subsection 1(7) provides for this, we believe, Convener. And I note that the Law Society of Scotland said that we agree the definition of a heat network should be sufficiently neutral to cover as many types of heat networks as possible. So I think we've tried to take our approach forward in that spirit, and I hope that's helpful to the committee.
Yes, I see. I think you're meaning section 1, subsection 7 in terms of the modification power in terms of regulations. And I don't think there's any provision in that section in terms of consultation prior to alteration in the regulations. So can you give us an indication of what the Scottish Government's position on that is? Would there be consultation on future amendment to the definitions, and where do we find a commitment to that?
Certainly, Convener, I would agree that if there was a change in definition, that would be something that we would need to consult with our stakeholders on to ensure that it was drafted appropriately. If I may, I bring in Mr Hempel just to address the particular point around what consultation mechanism we would use if we were to undertake that action.
Yeah, that's right. So it would be any changes would be subject to regulation, and I guess with any regulation that we make, we would envisage and be required to undertake a public consultation on that. It's just probably worth adding that the regulations that would follow the bill, we have committed to our existing heat networks working group that we'll work with the group on the development of those. That group is filled with quite a broad range of kind of existing network providers, local government and others who could inform how those regulations work.
Yes, you say you'd be required to consult, but I'm just interested where the commitment to that is if it's not in the bill. Is it a commitment made to this committee or the Parliament? Or
we can certainly look, Convener, to address that point, to give commitment in an appropriate way, to give reassurance to you, colleagues on the committee and indeed wider Parliament, if that would be helpful.
Thank you. Now, a final question perhaps from me, Minister. The definition section 1 subsection 1 refers to a heat network, meaning a district heat network or a communal heating system. And we know there are other types of systems, and I think you've referred to the possibility of certain other types of system. I appreciate the definition is meant to be inclusive rather than narrowing the definition down, probably for the reasons you set out, that as we move into the future, how these systems operate and work will change and develop, and there will be new systems. But I do wonder, I'm just wondering if you could explain why we don't have, in addition to the general definition, any other, or is there another list of specific systems that we now have that could be included?
I think I'll come back to colleagues in a second, Convener, on this point, but I'd imagine that this would fall into territory of being potentially being overly prescriptive in terms of a list that would then, obviously if it's enshrined in the face of the bill or in the primary legislation, would then have to be amended to address that list if there were changes in technologies that were included. We'll obviously look at the drafting, but that's my understanding of why we've kept it in the terms we have within the bill itself. We're obviously looking to take account of potential technological change that will happen over time. This bill is trying to replicate what we have already in terms of electricity and gas supply, a very complex legislative framework for both those particular energy sources. And in this case, we're trying to create from scratch appropriate licensing and regulatory regime for heat networks in Scotland. And we wouldn't want to have to keep coming back to amend primary legislation if there was a list in the bill.
Right. I think, Minister, what I was suggesting was a list by way of example as opposed to a list by way of definition, which we sometimes have in Acts. So it might be interesting if you were to come back to the committee.
Absolutely, Convener. We can come back with
and
our knowledge of existing systems that are in play, if that would be helpful to the committee, and ones which we understand are under development. And of course, I've referenced the ambient or shared loop systems as two examples of potentially new systems that have been referenced in evidence to the committee already.
All right, thank you. We come now to questions from Colin Beattie, who joined us remotely.
Thank you, Convener. Minister, perhaps I can look at one or two of the issues around the regulatory side. Can you give us an update on what dialogue there's been between the Scottish and UK governments on the development of a single UK regulatory system?
Certainly, Mr. Beattie raised an important point. I know this is clearly something which has exercised a number of witnesses in giving evidence to committee around, particularly around areas such as consumer protection. As I indicated in my opening remarks, we are in a position where we have had good dialogue with BEIS officials and indeed with the UK Minister, Kwasi Kwarteng, on these matters, and predecessors, Claire Perry O'Neill, for example, around the potential for some degree of either devolution or administrative devolution of consumer protection to the Scottish Parliament and to Scottish ministers. We are in a position where we had a number of options that were put to us. We have written back to Mr Kwarteng to indicate that if there is to be a GB-wide framework which would apply for consumer protection, which we understand UK ministers may bring forward in a bill early next year, then we would welcome that. That provides some certainty. We are seeking from UK ministers the ability for Scottish ministers to appoint a licensing authority and to appoint a body to oversee the implementation of those consumer protection powers in Scotland. And we'll wait for a response from Mr Kwarteng. We understand the solution we sought is one that is favoured by BEIS, but we have to wait for a response from that. That should hopefully allow us to go forward with the ability to appoint a body such as perhaps Ofgem, if the Ofgem are to be appointed by UK ministers to undertake that activity in England, then we can equally apply for Ofgem to be the appropriate body in Scotland. So there certainly, Section 4 of the bill enables Scottish ministers by regulations to appoint a licensing authority whose main function will be administering the licensing system. As Ofgem is a statutory body established by UK-wide legislation, it's not within devolved competence to appoint Ofgem as our licensing authority at present, hence why the measures that Mr Kwarteng may be willing to take would be enormously helpful. We're aware there's a risk of two organisations, Ofgem and the licensing authority created by the bill, operating in Scotland under two separate pieces of legislation, and that's what we want to avoid. Any confusion that might be created for consumers and the industry. And of course, we also want to deploy public money in an efficient manner as possible. So as I say, we've written to Mr Kwarteng with a suggested solution, and we're optimistic that agreement will be in place in the near future during the passage of the bill, and we're keen to keep the committee, of course, informed of that. Meanwhile, though, I would stress it's sensible the bill retains the flexibility for either Scottish ministers or a body within our gift to execute the important functions of the licensing authority in the event UK legislation in this area doesn't come forward. So at present we're expecting that bill to be introduced to the UK Parliament, but if it isn't, the flexibility in the bill gives us a fallback position that we can at least ensure the compliance of our bill in terms of legislative competence. So that clarifies the matter for Mr Beattie, but of course if I've not addressed what he was looking for, please do fire back to me, Mr Beattie.
While we're awaiting the outcome of your proposals, given where you stand at the moment, how would you see the proposed Scottish regulatory regime differing from the wider UK regime? Where would you see the differences that you'd like to feed in there? And what effect would a divergent licensing regime, if it came about, have on investment and consumers?
Really important points, both of those. I mean, firstly, I suppose in terms of the essential differences that we see with our approach to those of UK ministers. They've obviously taken a different approach in their proposals, which is a sort of authorisation mechanism, which, as I understand it, is obviously our approach is more in line with what the Competition and Market Authority were recommending in their report, and it's probably no surprise we obviously fed in significantly to that exercise and had been engaging with stakeholders throughout before the CMA's investigation was undertaken. But they have made recommendations which we believe are well aligned with the proposals we are bringing to Parliament in terms of our own approach. The authorisation approach the UK Government is taking is a valid approach, but we believe ours will give more investor certainty to the industry, and believe is a robust and proportionate system that we're putting in place. So I'm confident that what we're doing is right for Scotland and for our proposed use of heat networks and for our stakeholders in terms of the extensive engagement we've had with our stakeholders in the run-up to producing the bill. UK ministers obviously decided to take a different approach. Like I say, it's a valid approach, but it's just not one that we've chosen to take, and we believe the outcome in terms of our approach would be to give more investor certainty, given that we have learned a lot from what our colleagues in Norway and Denmark have done in developing heat networks in those two countries, and our approach is more consistent with the approach that's been taken elsewhere in Europe. I don't know whether, if it would be with your permission, Convener, bring in Mr Hempel, just to see if there's any points he wants to add in terms of the understanding of the UK's proposals.
Yeah, just echo what the Minister said there. I think it's important also to remember that just with the market having gone unregulated for so long, we feel that this licensing approach allows us to check on the fit and proper checks on existing operators, on things like their solvency, and to establish a real dialogue with the sector that I guess at the moment is not quite there, quite as we would like it. So we feel that that's one of the advantages that a more kind of proactive licensing system would provide.
Okay, thank you for that. We'll obviously wait with interest to see what the results are on this proposal going to the UK Government. I can move on a bit to licensing and to ask you, will the requirement for a licence apply to existing as well as new heat works? And how will existing heat networks and their operators be assimilated into the licensing system?
It is a very important point. I was checking, we various estimates of between 800 and 1,000 sort of heat networks that are already up and running in Scotland. So Mr Beattie raises a very pertinent point. We understand there may be some concerns over new technical standards being introduced, which would then apply to potentially to existing networks. I'd like to assure the committee, Mr Beattie, that we will be working with all existing heat networks to understand the implications for their operations in that event, and to identify appropriate solutions which can either be exemptions from such requirements or a special set of technical standards for existing networks. However, we're not going to place any requirements which would require replacement of good apparatus that's in good working condition to avoid any kind of disproportionate impacts on those networks. We are working with the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy base to develop a common technical standard that would apply across all of Great Britain, and we're happy to provide the committee and members of the Parliament with further information on this in due course, so there's as much visibility about the ongoing work around technical standards which may impact on existing networks as possible. We are trying to avoid being overly prescriptive at this stage in terms of primary legislation, and try and retain some scope for innovation as well as we go forward. We certainly, I hope that addresses much of what Mr Beattie was looking for in terms of the impact on existing networks.
Thank you, Minister. You've actually answered one of my questions on technical standards I was going to ask, but can I ask you about standard conditions which might be included in a licence? So, for example, important issues like consumer protection, quality of service, access to an ombudsman, would they be included as well? Is it envisaged that they will be incorporated in the licensing process?
Apologies to Mr Beattie for not addressing that in the earlier response. We are certainly trying to follow closely the approach that was set out to us by the Competition and Market Authority around the regulatory needs for existing heat networks, and trying to note that consumer detriment was most commonly found in smaller networks, particularly those that were privately owned. So we've tried to avoid being overly prescriptive, as I say. We're trying to make sure that in terms of existing schemes, the bill does enable exemptions in terms of, we're obviously in the early stages of developing regulations, but the range of factors, for example, the ownership structure, that could be considered in exempting networks. There may also be time limited. These may also be time limited to allow certain schemes to meet regulatory requirements if necessary. And Section 6, subsection 5 enables the licensing authority to exclude or modify any of the standard licence conditions it considers appropriate in the circumstances of the case, and this could be used to enable existing networks to gradually adapt to any regulatory requirements as are needed over time. And we certainly suggest that suggestion from committee members that we've noted is the requirement to hold a licence should not apply to those serving on their own buildings, for only their own buildings, I should say, and we agree that would be sensible. So in terms of those entirely private networks that are supporting the owner's own premises. In terms of any kind of conditions that Mr Beattie was trying to probe about, if I may bring in Mr Hempel on that point.
So on those consumer licence conditions, I'll maybe defer to legal colleague on the line, Norman MacLeod, but I would say that, as the Minister touched on, we're certainly anticipating GB-wide consumer standards to be coming in the not too distant future, and it looks as if we're working towards a solution to implementing that quite coherently in Scotland in a way that would see the consumer standards body for GB and Scotland's licensing authority being one and the same. I would also say that in the event that that GB-wide legislation didn't come forward, we are and we will continue to work with the Heat Trust, which is a consumer standards scheme which a lot of the large operators in the UK are signed up to. That includes things like transparency, quality of service, responses to outages. We're confident that the GB-wide legislation will materialise, but if not, there are other routes we can work towards within our competence. But I'll maybe defer to Norman MacLeod on that point.
Does Norman MacLeod want to make a comment?
I would only observe that, as many witnesses have already said, that consumer protection is, of course, a reserved matter. And so any licence condition, standard or otherwise, that are imposed would have to be done under the powers under the legislation, and therefore are clearly constrained by the limits of the current legislative competence of the Scottish Parliament. So none of this is news to the committee. And as far as possible, I'm sure the licence conditions will look to build in protections for consumers or businesses. But that is ultimately, this legislation sets a framework for, well, not the power for those conditions to be imposed, rather than setting out what the substance of them will be.
Just to add to what colleagues have said, just in setting out, as a general principle, we've tried to avoid putting the conditions into the face of the bill, and the bill has been drafted to allow conditions to be set out in more detail in secondary legislation, which we would propose to bring forward through affirmative instrument, I believe, which would allow for appropriate consultation on with Parliament and indeed with stakeholders on the nature of those conditions as they emerge. So if that gives the committee confidence in the context, I appreciate you're being asked in a very technical bill to look at a lot of detail, and we know there's a substantial number of delegated powers to be dealt with hereafter once if the bill receives royal assent. So, but to give you confidence, convener, that and committee members, that such matters be brought forward under second legislation, and the affirmative procedure would give Parliament a chance to scrutinise those.
Minister, thank you for that comprehensive response. You brought me neatly on to my last questions here, which are in relation to the Scottish and UK government discussions in relation to the devolution of consumer protection, and I wondered if you had any update on that.
I believe I have addressed much of that in my earlier remarks to Mr Beattie, but just to affirm that we have written to Kwasi Kwarteng to set out our own view on the options that have been presented to us, and that is that if a GB-wide consumer protection framework is to be delivered in legislation that UK Government will bring forward for its own heat networks bill in early next year, then we would welcome one of the proposed options, which would be to seek to give Scottish ministers the ability to appoint the licensing authority. As I've explained earlier on, currently it would, as I think Norman was indicating also, there are constraints on us in terms of the current reservation of powers in respect of being able to appoint Ofgem as our licensing authority. So we would need measures to be taken by UK ministers to allow us to do that. And that would, as I've indicated, we've kept flexibility in the bill in case that legislation doesn't come forward in the timescale as suggested by UK ministers. But our preference would clearly to be able to avoid confusion and to create a situation where we could appoint Ofgem, for example, and we have had discussions with Ofgem about this in principle, appoint Ofgem as the licensing authority for Scotland. It would also be a licensing authority, as we understand it, in England as well, and that would create a simplicity in the system. And with common technical standards being applied across both jurisdictions, obviously create a propitious market opportunity for development of the supply chain as well. So these are all factors that are in our thinking there, but I hope that is helpful to Mr Beattie and to committee.
Yes, that's very helpful. Just two last questions for you. How will the Scottish Government encourage existing and potential developers and operators to move away from gas in favour of renewable sources?
That's a hugely important point. Clearly, we've learned a lot from other jurisdictions, in particular referencing Denmark, where we've had close collaboration with the Danish government. They have achieved a very high level of utilisation of heat networks through initially creating heat networks with fossil fuel engines on them in the 70s in response to the oil gas price crisis in the early 1970s. We're in a different situation now. We're trying to develop heat networks in the context of a climate emergency and trying to avoid that step of going through a phase of building networks that are dependent on fossil fuels. We have some exciting opportunities come forward with the potential for deployment of hydrogen, for example. These are all things in our thinking. So we are looking at how we can utilise the renewable energy where possible to make sure that is within our scope. We have obviously kept definitions of heat networks sufficiently broad, as discussed earlier on in response to the convener, such that they can adapt over time as new technology emerges. But we're happy to give some further detail on that to Mr Beattie and the committee, if that would be helpful going forward.
Thanks very much. And my last question really relates to, are you going to be requiring or perhaps encouraging heat networks to publish their tariffs so consumers can compare what they're paying like other gas and electricity consumers, although I hope it would be better than that?
Well, clearly one of the big advantages of why we are taking forward this legislation is that heat networks have a huge potential to address fuel poverty. So we appreciate, in terms of the modelling we've done for the bill, that we believe by 2050 it could be saving about £80 million a year for consumers. And we appreciate that operating effectively and efficiently, heat networks can save up to 36% on bills faced by consumers. Clearly, Mr Beattie is quite right. We need to ensure that as much visibility is out there around the benefits of heat networks, and to obviously monitor and evaluate their performance of heat networks as they are constructed. And there will be, through the legislation that we're discussing today, the ability to ensure that there is appropriate monitoring and evaluation data from heat networks that are established under the legislation to inform that. Obviously, in advance of seeing the UK Government's legislation around consumer protection, then we obviously have to see how that lands in terms of the requirements for reporting, for example, of pricing of networks. But it's clearly something both UK ministers and ourselves are very conscious of, the need to try and make sure that heat networks, where they go in and identified through the heat LHEs and heat zoning. We will obviously be seeking to have networks developed in the more optimal locations where they can impact on fuel poverty and make a substantial impact on socio-economic benefits for communities. And that can then flow through into hopefully good results in terms of data that will not only affirm the positive reasons why people join the heat network, but encourage others to join the network as well.
Minister,
Thank you, Convener.
Minister, you...
sorry, thank you, Minister. Back to you, Convener.
Thank you. I had thought it was already back with me. However, thank you for the clarification to Mr. Beattie. Minister, you talk about the Danish system, for example, and what I want to ask just as a follow-up to that, what have you done or what is the Scottish Government doing in terms of discussion with other countries where they have successful heat networks as to public information on these matters? So partly, of course, such a system, if it's a shared system, which we tend not to be familiar with in Scotland, apart from one or two places where this is in place, is, of course, responsible use of the system. And I'm not referring to some people need to keep their homes warmer than others because of health issues or whatever, for whatever reason, but just responsible use of the system so that there's not a wastage. And I suppose that's the first point. And the second is how to ensure that such systems are 100% reliable in the sense that everyone can be certain that if the system goes down, it will immediately be made to operate again, or that there's a backup system. So these 2 points, because I think they're fairly crucial in terms of success of any system or public acceptance of it in Scotland.
I think, Convener, you hit on a couple of really important points, because we have obviously in the desire to develop heat networks as a contributor to tackling climate change and delivering on fuel poverty. We also want to make sure that we have a robust system that protects the consumer and gives them confidence that in joining a heat network they are not setting themselves up for a fall. So it's absolutely essential in learning from the success, I believe, in Norway and Denmark, particularly Denmark, where we've had a lot of engagement on a government-to-government level in developing our earlier thinking around heat networks, to learn from how that has benefited. Now obviously, when heat networks are established, unlike your boiler, perhaps in your domestic property, where you've got all the disadvantages of having to maintain that yourself and potential fire risks and carbon monoxide risks, there are a number of direct consumer benefits of not having those responsibilities going forward. With the wet systems that tend to be created by heat networks, that risk is all taken away from you. But you obviously have a concern to make sure that if the system fails, what happens? And heat networks tend to have backup systems in place. So you may have a entirely renewable system which has at present perhaps a gas or other form of backup engine to kick in should a system fail. Obviously, if the developer falls into financial trouble, we also need to give confidence to individuals as to what happens in that scenario. So UK Government and ourselves are taking slightly different approaches, I think, in terms of the approach there. The UK Government's pursuing step-in powers. We've set in the bill powers around transfers to enable an alternative operator to take over a heat networks, and that's established if the developer gets into financial difficulty or decides to dispose of the network for whatever reason. So I believe the bill does provide the legislative certainty around these areas, but certainly, Convener, if there are specific points you want to probe about, happy to try and address them if I can.
Well, I think one of the key points was my other point about public awareness of responsible use of heating, if I can put it that way. It may be something that the Minister could come back to committee in writing on, just to set out what steps have been taken to see how other countries work that into their approach to this area.
Yeah, I take the point, Convener. They will certainly come back to you in some more detailed thinking around that. I appreciate this is a new market. It'll take a lot to perhaps educate consumers as to what's involved in a heat network and obviously the benefits to them of participating in a heat network, and also the importance of tackling the emissions that are created by heat. I suppose it stands to reason, as the committee members will know, over half the energy we consume in Scotland is in the form of heat. And if we are to be serious about tackling the climate emergency, then clearly this is an area we need to make far greater progress on. I'm very proud of what we've done on electricity supply as a country. I'm less proud of where we are on heat, but I think this is a common problem across most of Northern Europe, where we are still very dependent on fossil fuel systems, and 81% of premises in Scotland are still dependent on gas central heating as their primary source of heat. So this is going to be a big transformation in the way we potentially we undertake our heating. Not for every premises, because it will heat zoning, and the LHE's process will identify those areas of Scotland where this is most appropriate. It will not be an appropriate approach in many communities, where it will not make an economically viable alternative, but where it is happening, it will be done through a system that hopefully leads to networks developing where it's most appropriate to support communities. And that in truth should give some confidence to communities that it will only be happening where it's actually going to be an efficient technology to provide them with their heat. But I take the point, we'll come back perhaps on some more information about public communication and what we can do to build the market in terms of engagement with communities.
All right, now Rhoda Grant, who joins us remotely.
Thank you, Convener. Can I just welcome what the Minister said in his opening statement with regard to poverty, but can I ask what form does he think the consideration of fuel poverty will take in this amendment at stage 2?
Thank you to Rhoda Grant for raising an important point. We're aware, and we've heard concerns from the committee members, including Ms Grant and indeed panellists, that the bill should be strengthened in regards to fuel poverty. I hope that we can provide assurance today that contributing to the eradication of fuel poverty has been an absolute priority for the Scottish Government as we've developed the bill, and this is reflected obviously in the evidence of witnesses such as Energy Action Scotland as well, in terms of they have emphasised themselves that and I quote here, "We are encouraged to note the focus on fuel poverty, and this appears to be an encouraging commitment to co-design this policy alongside the Scottish Government's commitment stated in its Fuel Poverty Act," unquote. Heat networks do have a really important role to play in tackling fuel poverty. The CMA noted that the vast majority of heat network customers face costs that are similar or lower than gas, and the business and regulatory impact assessment accompanying the bill estimates that in the right circumstances, heat networks can provide savings of up to, as I said earlier on, up to 36% for households compared to gas heating. We're keen to put this beyond all doubt, though, and to respond to these concerns. So my officials and I will be happy to work with the committee and individual members of the committee, such as Ms Grant, to ensure that, and also with the Fuel Poverty Panel and Partnership Forum over the coming months, to put those reassurances within the bill itself. Happy to engage with Ms Grant and others who have an interest in that area.
Okay, thank you. I also welcome that local government will be involved in consenting. What form will that take, and will it impact on deemed consent?
We certainly are keen to ensure that, as Ms Grant indicates, that there is appropriate involvement with local government. I know that's something that's come up in a number of evidence sessions to date, and we are obviously engaging with local government members around the development of LHEs through to the heat zoning mechanisms, which are being taken forward by Zero Waste Scotland in terms of engagement with stakeholders to develop those. We're trying to retain as much flexibility in the system that we have put forward in the bill around the licensing activities and the consenting process as possible. We're aware that a number of local authorities may have relatively little heat network activity in practice, and we're trying to keep things proportionate, but we are keen to engage with local government colleagues around the development of the consenting powers in the bill. In terms of the engagement with local authority members, I can perhaps bring in Mr Hempel just to refer to how we're proposing to take that forward with COSLA and with individual local authority.
So as the Minister touched on, we've commissioned colleagues at Zero Waste Scotland to I guess, they've got the technical expertise that will give us a first draft on how you identify a heat network zone. We expect that should be completed, at least the first draft of that, towards the end of the year, early 2021. Obviously, with the Minister's agreement, I'm sure we'd be happy to share that with the committee. In terms of how we take that then forward, we would bring that to the working group that I referred to earlier, which has 3 local authorities on it, 3 local authority energy officers, to develop that a little bit further. And in the kind of longer term, we would envisage consulting publicly on that and working with, as the Minister said, COSLA in particular on that. It's possible that we might do this in conjunction with the planned introduction of local heat and energy efficiency strategies. We expect that the process for identifying a heat network zone would be captured within the development of in preparation of a local heat and energy efficiency strategy.
With your permission, just add one further point, for clarity's sake, and to assist Ms Grant. As both James and myself have referenced around heat network zones, just referencing specifically section 40 of the bill. The intention of the section is not to enable Scottish ministers to overrule local authorities, which I think where the sensitivity perhaps has come in terms of the evidence, or to disregard local views in any ways. But we must remember we're living through a global climate emergency, and we must also be confident we're fully able to identify all potential heat network opportunities to address that climate emergency. So, for example, and I was alluding to this earlier, should there be a local authority that's unable to do this, or where we have evidence that there may be particularly good opportunities that have gone unidentified, there needs to be an opportunity for the Scottish ministers to carry out that function. This would, of course, just to reassure Ms Grant, be subject to consultation with the local authority and other relevant persons, such as the public locally, of course, prior to the implementation of a zone. And we know that we urgently need to stimulate our economy as well in terms of the Green Recovery and Heat Networks Bill. We believe in providing the legislative framework for Heat Networks Bill very much fit the profile of the kind of projects that can make a near-term contribution to the green recovery, as they are large-scale infrastructure projects with high upfront capital costs. And that's something I know local authority colleagues that I've spoken to are very much welcome. They recognise the economic impact there may be at a local level from these projects. And once constructed, they are long-lived assets which will hopefully create long-term jobs in those communities as well. So we hope it's a positive reason why we've got the legislation is framed in the way it is, to allow for circumstances where local authority perhaps needs that support to take forward heat network zones.
So just for clarity, local government will be involved in zoning, and I think I heard you right saying communities will have a role in that, but not in consenting individual applications, development applications. Is that right? Have I?
I think certainly we're aware of this, the demands that have been put on committee in relation to evidence sessions that have been taken so far. In terms of the consenting process, we've tried to put in as much flexibility to allow for circumstances where perhaps a local authority, a smaller local authority, perhaps may not wish to take on that responsibility itself. If there's only occasionally projects which are appropriate in its area, to not have to staff up and tool up for function that's only rarely required. But we can certainly come back on the issue that has been raised in evidence sessions to the committee around the responsibility. There may be larger local authorities that would be very keen to take forward consenting, and I know there's been some debate around thresholds as well, at which that would potentially kick in. I don't know whether that's something that, James, you want to say anything further on that, or you?
No, that's echo what the Minister says there.
Okay, can I just quickly ask about appeal system for developers? There is no right of appeal in the bill. Do you think that's going to change, or what's the thinking behind that?
Well, it's a complex situation at present. I recognise why Ms Grant is asking for this. We have a situation at the moment, because of the way the legislation is drafted around the identification of the licensing authority, for example, and obviously we're getting into a position where hopefully we will have more clarity on the potential options we have around licensing authority going forward. But we do recognise that there are situations where perhaps there would be necessary for an appeal if the business concerned was unhappy with the outcome of the licensing decision. And at the moment that would, in the legislation, provides for that potentially that role to be sitting with Scottish ministers. Now normally you might have another body that then would appeal up to Scottish ministers to receive clarity on the position, and subsection 5 of section 11 makes clear provision for licence holders to make representations to the licensing authority before a revocation takes effect, for example, if a licence is to be revoked. We believe that it's important to remember that in exercising functions under the bill, including those relating to licence revocations and other appeals, licensing authority itself must act lawfully, and if it did not, this would be challengeable in the courts, of course. So just ask the committee to consider to which body over and above the licensing authority, it will certainly be interesting in committee's views around which body over and above licensing authority appeals would be brought to, particularly given the bill currently as drafted designates Scottish ministers as a licensing authority in the first instance. But as I say, we'd like to get to a position where Ofgem potentially or another, as recommended by Parliament, would be the licensing authority, and therefore could appeal up to Scottish ministers in that scenario. We believe it's important, obviously, that appeal mechanisms are clear, and we'll certainly look to work with the committee, taking forward any recommendations you have in terms of the drafting of the bill. I don't know, but it might be appropriate to bring in terms of Norman on this one. Would it be? Yep. If with your permission, convener.
Yes. Has something to say to add to that?
Well, largely to reiterate what the Minister said, that obviously there are various mechanisms in the bill or processes which require licences or consent, and these, to a large extent, have mechanisms built into the process, some on the face of the bill, some possibly by regulation, whereby obviously a developer or application for consent or a licence will have an opportunity to make representations to the moment Scottish ministers as to the determination of those applications. But once that decision's made, the decision's made at the moment in terms of the legislation by ministers. So the question would be, what form of appeal might there be? And appeals could either be essentially like an administrative appeal where someone gets to make the decision again, but then they can alter the decision the ministers have already made on the substance of the issue, or, as the minister said, on the legality of the process and whether ministers have properly considered all the matters that they were due to consider, and that appeal would go to the courts, which of course is open in terms of the legislation as drafted.
The only thing I would add, conveners, is we recognise that judicial review is not a cheap process for any party, and so clearly we're conscious of that would be, if the licensing authority were the Scottish ministers, if we were to have that fallback position, as I say, in the UK legislation wasn't to proceed on the timescale we estimate, we would have that fallback where Scottish ministers would effectively be the enforcement authority. But we are clear that if we were able to designate another body as enforcement authority within then subsection 2 of section 32 enables for an appeal to be made to a third party, which in that circumstance might be the Scottish ministers ourselves, but albeit likely to be administered by the Scottish Government's Energy Consents Unit in practice with recommendations to ministers. Well, that's helpful to Ms Grant.
Minister, you refer to judicial review. Is that ultimately the court form of review that is contemplated with reference to this bill?
We'd obviously wish to avoid that, convener, if we can get the clarity we're seeking in terms of the role of licensing authority and the enforcement authority functions. But yes, I mean, judicial review ultimately is a course that would be available in circumstances where the Scottish ministers found ourselves as the enforcement authority and there needed to be an appeal because there's nobody to appeal above other than to the courts. So that would be the situation in that fallback scenario.
Why is there not a statutory right of appeal set up in the Act, which could then be exercised in the Sheriff Court, for example, rather than having to use judicial review in the Court of Session, which of course is more expensive, more difficult for individuals, organisations or others.
If I may, convener, bring in Norman on this, if it's possible, just to give us the legal perspective on the respective courts.
I mean, these choices are obviously open in terms of legislation, although it may be worthwhile just noticing that appeals on enforcement notices in planning legislation would be made to the Court of Session and not to Sheriff Court. So that's the equivalence of those type of enforcement provisions.
Are you able to shed light on section 32 and the, I mean, it's set out so that Scottish ministers may by regulations make provision for about appeals, why it's not specified in the Act itself, which would make or makes things clearer if it is specified in the actual Act, as certainly historically would have been the case and often is the case.
Well, I think the Minister really alluded to this already, that the Enforcement Authority in terms of Section 28 is the Scottish Ministers as the bill is drafted, or such other person as ministers may by regulation designate. So the regulation provisions are there to enable appeals to be put in place where the Enforcement Authority not to be ministers.
Convener, I don't know whether it helps.
In broad terms.
I don't know whether it helps here, just may confuse things further, but you can obviously come back to committee in writing if it's helpful. But I think there's an important point to be made. Assuming the decisions made by the Enforcement Authority, which may of course obviously be Scottish ministers, or under Section 28, as Norman was indicating, Scottish ministers may designate another body as an enforcement authority, regardless of whether it's Scottish ministers or another enforcement authority. Assuming the decisions made by that enforcement authority were reasonable and lawful, then the appeal would have to be to a body or person who's ultimately greater authority than the enforcement body itself. So hence that's why I think if it was lawful, you might have to go potentially to the courts to overturn that decision.
So basically this scheme, as it were, is trying to align it to planning legislation effectively in terms of rights of appeal, or that or model on the planning sort of approach.
I can certainly see the similarities myself, but I may just ask Norman to confirm that is the case, given I'm not an expert in planning law in that sense.
I mean, essentially that is correct. There's equivalence between the planning systems. They're both regulating how consents are to be enforced, and there's, I think, merit in the two systems being broadly equivalent.
Right, thank you. We now come to questions from Maurice Golden.
Thank you, Convener. I'm interested in the transfer schemes and how the Scottish Government will address the risk that existing heat network operators may not obtain a licence for their network, potentially leaving customers without heat.
We certainly, in terms of transfer schemes, as Mr. Golden raises a very important point. This is about, I think, essential to giving consumers confidence to embrace heat networks as an option, not just individual consumers, but obviously business consumers who've got clearly risk to factor into their ongoing business activities. And in terms of the arrangements around transfer schemes, we are taking perhaps a subtly different approach to UK ministers who are proposing, as I understand it, step-in rights. This is the way they've determined it. But it is important to try and provide for scenarios where, for a number of reasons, it could be perhaps insolvency of the operator, it could be other reasons that the heat network is no longer able to operate with the original developer. And so ultimately there are some circumstances where potentially Scottish ministers themselves could take responsibility for the operation of the scheme until such time as an alternative provider was identified. But clearly we want to try and make sure that that process is as smooth as possible for the consumers, and to ensure that there's as much certainty in the process as is possible. In terms of the approach that's been taken, we believe it is an appropriate one. And in terms of the obviously we have to wait until such time as we have further clarity about the GB-wide consumer protection standards that may apply as well in terms of the wider framework that we would be taking it forward. But I wonder if I may bring in this particular issue, Mr Hempel, convener, just to set out the technical aspects of the transfer scheme itself.
Okay. So I guess in the bill as drafted, the transfer schemes would apply to new networks that are built on the basis that the transfer is agreed kind of at the same time as the heating network consent being awarded or granted or considered. We think that's probably useful because I guess it's helpful for all parties to understand in the worst case scenario what transfer, what changes would occur to ensure that the supply of the heat continues. Provisions kind of relating to the supplier of last resort or the step-in rates that the Minister referred to, we understand and have been kind of included in the original UK Government consultation on a market framework for GB. So these would be one of the consumer standards that would apply GB-wide. I would maybe ask Norman to potentially comment on the use of compulsory purchase rights here and the relevance here, whether how those can be used for existing schemes should they be needed to ensure continued supply.
Well, I'm not really sure where to start with that one. The compulsory purchase is obviously an option in terms of the legislation, but it's not a quick process. So protection for existing schemes is not directly covered by this legislation. As James has already mentioned, the Part 7 provisions on transfer schemes apply to networks that will be obtaining consent or in either for new schemes or for modified schemes after the legislation is in place.
If I can, convener, just to add one point which might help committee members and indeed wider audience understand the difference between what's proposed here and perhaps what pertains to the supplier of last resort arrangements for gas and electricity markets. The way we have kind of viewed what we have in the bill is it's more akin to asking what would happen in the event that the gas or electricity asset owners failed or lost their right to operate. So that's potentially the Scottish Gas Networks or SSEN, for example, or SPEN, Scottish Power Energy Networks, in terms of the infrastructure owners. Those assets are owned by a small number of companies, but many more do and will in future own Scotland's heat network. So there's potentially a large number of owners of networks across Scotland. And the approach is different in that respect, that for gas and electricity supply markets, that system only replaces a company which is responsible for purchasing and selling the energy itself to the consumer and for customer-facing functions, whereas heat networks consist of infrastructure assets as well, so that both the service and the infrastructure are together. And so that's why the approach we've taken in the bill is kind of modelled more on what would happen in the event of hopefully never happen in terms of SGN or SSEN or SPEN sort of coming into difficulty. So it's there are kind of different approaches that can be taken, and the approach we've taken in the bill is modelled on that sort of example. And I would also just draw, I won't read it out in full, convener, but obviously Professor Paisley from the University of Aberdeen has very much welcomed the approach we've taken in the bill in terms of his chair of Scots Law at University of Aberdeen.
Thank you, Minister. But just to clarify, the 800 plus existing heat networks are not directly addressed in the bill. Do you think they should be?
If we just clarify that point, just make sure, are they addressed?
No, it applies to new schemes. I think it's worth saying though that certainly those 800 to 1100 schemes that we understand are out there at the moment, that's a big number. In practice, that equates to about 1% of Scotland's heat demand. So today it is a big number. But where we would expect, if we look at this bill as meeting its objectives of maybe getting us towards the range of 7 to somewhere in the high teens in terms of heat demand that is projected, then the vast majority of schemes will be captured by these transfer schemes in future, with this kind of safeguard of GB-wide standards and step-in rights to come to support the existing schemes.
The point around the step-in rights, convener, is probably where we need to just understand the interaction between what you can come and bring forward early next year. Hopefully we'll see it in the lifetime of the passage of this bill, and our own section 7 of the bill, so that we can understand the interactions and take that into account. But it's an important point in terms of the fallback of the GB-wide consumer protection framework, that hopefully we will have a role in appointing the licensing authority to oversee and to ensure consumer protection is delivered in Scotland.
Thanks. So just to clarify, Minister, you're confident and comfortable that either through secondary legislation or some other means that existing customers of the existing heat network would be able to ensure that they're still provided with that heat one way or another going forward?
Well, certainly every indication we have is that UK ministers will bring forward a bill which would apply, GB-wide consumer protection standards, which would give some protection to those existing consumer on existing heat networks. So in that respect, we have no reason to doubt UK ministers' willingness to do that. Obviously, with COVID-19 and other factors, there's a possibility their bill is delayed. I hope not. We've certainly had no indication, I think, so far that there's intention to delay the bill in terms of the engagement with officials. But that would provide hopefully that safety net for those who are in existing networks. And obviously our legislation would deal with the new networks, as Mr Hempel has outlined.
Thank you. Just final question on the overall regulation of the localised monopolies of heat networks. Do you see a conflict potentially between ensuring the lowest possible price for the customer and ensuring the best rate of return and therefore most attractive investment market for companies and others to run heat networks in Scotland?
Well, I think it's, I know certainly from your own background, Mr Golden, you've got a strong interest in sort of regulatory matters, and you'll understand very much the nature of creating natural monopolies in this situation. It is certainly something that we've been very mindful of, and trying to make sure not only in the presence of any GB-wide consumer protection framework, but also in terms of steps we are taking ourselves around the LHEs, the zoning, and also the application for consents. That in the consenting process takes account of the underpinning of the case for the heat network and the benefits it potentially provide locally, but also the impact on fuel poverty and what contribution it will make to supporting tackling fuel poverty within the community as being a part of the process that will be taken into account and hopefully formalised, and therefore we'll have an understanding of how that natural monopoly will actually contribute to the achievement of the fuel poverty goals and fuel poverty targets that we have. Also, there's we've allowed provision for that natural monopoly to only last as long as effectively the payback of the infrastructure investment takes place, and thereafter potentially other operators could take over the operation of that network, should there be a potentially more attractive proposition there. And I think that might be an area that we certainly welcome the committee's views on in terms of the approach that we are taking here to try and ensure that we avoid any higher costs for consumers. In practice, most heat networks, as I've alluded to earlier on, have demonstrated the ability to be at least competitive with gas and ideally cheaper than gas. And if well designed and in the right place, which hopefully the LHEs and heat zoning will ensure takes place, potential for contribution to reducing bills by up to 36%. So I would hope that it would be extremely rare for there to even be any suggestion that natural monopoly was leading to higher costs for consumers. In practice, I would hope it would be a degree to which there are either small decreases in cost or big decreases in cost, depending on how well that heat network is run and designed. So I think hopefully with the approach we're taking, we will enshrine those principles right for the very start of the process.
Thank you, Minister. Is there any analysis being conducted over consumer confidence issues around not having a boiler in the person's home and moving to a district heat network? Obviously, there's some existing heat networks there. I was just wondering if that was a barrier or not something to be concerned about.
I think anything that's, I suppose, quite a significant change like this in someone's day-to-day life will probably make people pause for thought and be maybe nervous before they commit. But I think in addressing the point the convener has asked us to, in terms of coming back perhaps with more information about public engagement and how we would build the case for heat networks, which is an important point, we can hopefully come forward with a way in which communication of the benefits of a heat network are explicit, transparent and understandable for the consumer, so they can make informed choices about whether to join the network. As you know, we were not proposing to compel consumers to join networks for a number of reasons, including ECHR, but we are certainly, I think it would be in everyone's interest, including the investor, to make sure that there was, and indeed the licensing authority, to make sure there was clarity about the benefits to the consumer of a heat network, so they are able to make an informed choice, which will hopefully help the environment as well as help their bottom line. So clear information about the costs of the network, whole life costs, and the costs that the consumer themselves face would be really key to that, I think.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Convener.
Yes, I'm conscious of time, and we're grateful for everyone's enthusiasm on this topic, but I'd like to try and get all committee members in. And Minister, on the point that was raised with you about existing heat networks and the requirement to have heat network consent, I mean, I think that's sections 17 and 18 of the bill. Presumably, in terms of Section 18, the Scottish Government will be looking to simply issue either exemptions or licences to existing heat operators subject to them maintaining certain standards. But I don't want an answer now, but perhaps that's something that you could come back in writing to the committee on to clarify that point.
Happy to do that, Convener. I appreciate that it's maybe a technical point, and we can come back in depth that you require for the report.
Thank you. Richard Lyle.
Yeah, okay. We're maybe under time, but I think there's quite a lot of questions got to be asked and a lot of answers to be given. How much a game changer do you think this bill will make, Minister?
As I alluded to earlier on, I think Mr Lyle's quite right to identify that more than half the energy we consume as a country in Scotland, and this is not unusual for countries in Northern Europe, is in the form of heat. So it has been variously in recent years 54 to 51% in terms of the percentage of energy we consume. So if we're serious about tackling climate change, we absolutely have to hit this goal. Clearly, fuel poverty is a statutory obligation for the government, and with statutory fuel poverty targets as well. And I think we're all aware of the rising cost of energy for consumers, and particularly those who are dependent on electric-only heating. There will be opportunities perhaps to give them lower cost heat supplies through heat networks, but also the need to decarbonise from our gas networks over time as well. So the estimates we have are that by 2050, and model I think about 9.7 sort of terawatt hours of heat being provided through heat networks annually. This would, I think that's about 12% of, so if we were to meet 12%, which is about mid-range in terms of 7 to 17% range that Mr Hempel was referring to earlier on, in terms of the potential we think for heat networks in Scotland, then that would be reducing energy bills by about £80 million per annum by 2050, and saving about 0.3 megatons of CO2 equivalent in terms of emissions annually as well. So making a significant, if not definitive, but a significant contribution to tackling our climate targets. And obviously that 0.3 megatons may offset something more difficult for society to have to contemplate in terms of reducing our emissions. So we also believe there are consumer benefits to take into account in terms of removing the risk, almost at a stroke, of anyone having any kind of carbon monoxide poisoning risks, or the hassle of replacing their boiler on every defined period, 10, 15 years, maintenance of their boilers, and being potentially left without any heat at all which is obviously a risk for consumers. With a heat network, you have a backup supply, so there would be always a means of providing alternative heating supply to consumers. That's not to say the system couldn't break fundamentally if there was a leak, if it was a wet system or something like that, but for most circumstances there would be a fallback if the principal heat engine of the network was to go down. There would be a backup supply. So I think there's multiple benefits there, but primarily it's about tackling fuel poverty, and if we can save in the best networks up to 36% of someone's heating costs, that's going to have a huge benefit for a family that's struggling to make a living, and obviously allow them to have hopefully a warmer home that we know helps with health and education. So there's a range of associated benefits that come from that investment.
Yeah, I totally agree. There's obviously comment about heating or eating. So this could be good for consumers and could also be good for the climate. Is there a risk that the duty on local authorities to consider undertaking the designation of zones will lead to a lot of studies but very little action? That's the concern that I have. What action will the Scottish Government take to ensure that zones are designated and networks are built and we really mean what we say in this bill?
Well, I think we do mean what we say. I think some of the earlier questions allude to some of the powers that are in the bill in terms of Scottish ministers potentially also taking on the potential for undertaking heat network zoning if there was an issue with maybe perhaps it not being delivered properly, or there was an opportunity that was identified that hadn't been captured in the heat network zoning and the LHEs. So we have the ability. We're obviously wanting to work very closely with local government colleagues in that respect. There may be potentially smaller local authorities. It could be larger local authorities who decide they don't want to take on this responsibility. So clearly Scottish ministers would perhaps have a more direct role in making sure that information was provided. But we all are in a space where there's I think a very big economic prize to be won here in terms of investment, in terms of in developing heat networks, the potential for local employment opportunities. I know local authorities I've spoken to are very keen to see heat networks develop in their areas and to see the potential for long-term sustained jobs in their communities because of the nature of the project. So I think there's a number of reasons to believe that local partners would be very enthusiastic about doing this. They may need support if they are a smaller local authority or if it's a new area for them, clearly, and we have made commitments to resource some of the costs that would come with developing the LHEs and the heat zoning. But we clearly would want to work with individual local authorities if they were struggling to deliver these functions to ensure that they get the support they need.
Could there be an obligation to require local authorities to state whether they intend to issue zone permits or to publish a commercialisation plan, help to provide further certainty? And I'll roll this other question into that question. In what circumstances does the Scottish Government expect to designate a heat network zone under Section 40, and does it expect that this will be a regular occurrence?
I would hope it wouldn't be a regular occurrence in terms of the point that we have just made in terms of the zoning. As I said earlier on, it's our intention to avoid overruling local authorities. We've got some powers in there, obviously, or to disregard local views, which I know would cause ill feeling and insensitivity to the local views would not be helpful. But we had put in place in terms of Section 40 that Mr Lyle references that, as I say, the circumstances where a local authority was unable to do perform the function, or where we've evidence that perhaps particularly good opportunities that have gone unidentified as part of that process, so an error of omission rather than deliberately kind of objecting to something being in the zoning, that there would be a need for Scottish ministers to carry out that function. And as in reference to the earlier remarks Ms Grant was making, I just want to emphasise that would obviously be in with consultation with the local authority themselves. So we wouldn't ignore the local authority in performing that function, and indeed we'd also consult with other local persons, relevant persons such as the local community itself, prior to the implementation of a zone if we had to step in that way under Section 40. As I say, I think in practice it'd probably be very rare that we would have to do that. Local authorities seem to be genuinely enthusiastic about the local employment opportunities and obviously how this integrates with their local development planning process as well.
lastly, does the timing of this bill before the local heat and energy efficiency strategy becomes statutory allow for adequate planning and preparation should the statutory provisions for local heat and energy efficiency strategies have come first? And what role will communities and local authorities have in relation to the planning and designation of heat networks outside the local heat and energy efficiency strategies? Because it all comes down, and you know this only too well, Minister, it all comes down to local communities and local authorities, what they want, and to ensure that they get what they want.
Yeah, I think Mr. Lau, you're absolutely right about that. I mean, clearly we've got to see a situation where heat networks are happening in the right places according to properly evidenced LHEs. We have been doing an exercise whereby all 32 Scottish local authorities have been engaged in piloting LHEs in their local area. We're learning a lot from that about the resourcing the local authorities have, their ability to deliver them, the technical aspects of delivering local heat and energy efficiency strategies at a local level as well. The final 9 that are going through the piloting, we hope will report back in the early part of 2021. So we should have, in theory, all 32 local authorities have fed back to us any challenges they face in delivering LHEs usually on a sub-area basis. They're just piloting in a small area of the local authority to see how this works. Our proposal is to take forward the delivery of a statutory duty to underpin the LHEs. That's largely to give further investor certainty and to give some standing to the LHEs in terms of how it informs the investor decisions, that if there's something that's a statutory footing, it's been done sort of a consistent basis in a consistent way across all 32 local authorities, it then forms a very important piece of evidence to underpin their business case for putting together a heat network and to go to finance to get the funding for it, because it gives them a little bit of confidence to the investors, because our aim is to try and achieve what has been done in Denmark and Norway, where you have relatively they're seen as low-risk investments in those markets, and therefore they can attract finance at a low cost of debt and to allow the sector to grow. In terms of LHEs, we propose to put that statutory duty in place through powers under the Climate Change Act 2009 to do secondary legislation to do that. And obviously that would be subject to approval of Parliament.
Thank you, Minister, for your blunt answers.
Thank you.
John Mason.
Thanks very much, Convener. Minister, you previously said you didn't want to use compulsion or an obligation to connect to a network. And I just wonder if you could explain your thinking in that, because, I mean, it seems to me if I replace my boiler, that's an individual decision. It doesn't affect anyone else. But a heat network, by its very definition, is a community asset. It's a community thing. And therefore, is there not an argument for a bit of compulsion in here and a bit of obligation to connect?
I certainly recognise that. I mean, from the outset, in terms of the expert working group and the heat networks group that we've established more recently, there's been some debate around, and indeed this is featured in the evidence to the committee, about the degree to which we can mandate connections to the network. We obviously are taking forward this discussion in the context of a fairly complex legal landscape that we have, both in terms of reserve powers, but also ECHR and other considerations that have to be taken into account in terms of the obligation to connect. And it might be helpful, Convener, I appreciate time is tight, but if I can set out a bit of detail, because I think this is going to be quite an important area for debate going forward about the consideration of this. I can't obviously disclose legal advice, and I hope the committee would appreciate that, but I'll try to outline some of the legal issues that arise in relation to mandatory connection to heat networks. The reduction of demand risk using the mandatory connection is likely to involve more than just the power for a heat network operator to carry out works when they install equipment in order to connect a building to the heat network and have the ability to keep that equipment in place and have rights of access to maintain, replace and renew the equipment. It's more fundamentally a requirement on the owner or the occupier of the building to use and indeed to pay for the heat from that network. And this would also appear to require obligations on the heat network operator to supply heat as well. So the power to carry out works to alter another person's property without their permission, and indeed in the face of objection, which might potentially be a situation that might arise, it clearly involves an interference with that person's property rights, and therefore has the potential to engage the provisions of the European Convention on Human Rights. So a requirement to use heat from a heat network is also likely to engage the provisions of the ECHR, as there is an ongoing interference with the property rights, not just in relation to the maintenance of equipment, but in relation to the compulsory imposition of obligations by the terms and conditions of the arrangements for supply of heat. I know that's a bit legalese, but something that the community will be very comfortable with, but I hope it's trying to set out that, you know, that we have some really quite complex legislative kind of landscape here that we're trying to undertake this. You know, there's the engagement of protections of ECHR is not, of course, of itself a bar to mandatory connection. It's possible to both interfere with property rights and comply with ECHR, provided it can be shown the interference is fair and proportionate and justifiable when balancing the impacts of the individual against the public interest. But the bill indeed already includes in Part 6 provisions for the imposition of mandatory network way leave rights by means of necessary way leave, and these are framed in sufficiently broad terms to enable the installation of a heat network apparatus on, under or over any land which would include buildings. So we believe we have tried to put as much in there as we can to enable the efficient delivery of the infrastructure, to bring the cost of the capital cost of that, keep that to a minimum, and allowing for the possibility that perhaps even if the original occupier of the building that's being connected up to isn't interested in being part of the heat network, it's as low cost as possible for the next occupier or owner of the building to say, yes, please, I would like to be connected to the network. So we're trying to be as proportionate and balanced in the approach we've taken to this as possible. But I hope it's helpful to the committee to set out some of the concerns we have around ECHR, and I apologise for taking so long in that answer, Convener, but I think it would be helpful just to set that out to the committee.
I appreciate your answer. I mean, I'll let the legal brains, who are greater than mine, go through it in detail going forward. I suppose I'm, you know, on the practical side of things, I'm just thinking, I mean, I totally accept there's legal impediments, and yet, I mean, it's different in a new area because I've got the Commonwealth Games Village and it's just everybody's on the network and that's fine. But presumably we're focusing here more on existing buildings. And I mean, it does seem obvious that in a lot of networks, you're wanting some kind of anchor tenant or anchor user or anchor load or whatever the correct term is. And I just wonder if we can't go down the kind of openly mandatory route, are there other options, you know, carrot and stick kind of thing? Because I believe in Denmark, for example, there's a kind of standing charge if a building could connect but chooses not to connect. And I mean, I don't know whether we could use the rate system or something like that to kind of, you know, penalise people who choose not to join in for no good reason, even though by not telling them, but at least they're going to have to pay more.
I mean, I maybe invite colleagues to come on to the issue that you raise in regards to Denmark, an example that's been used there. But certainly what we are trying to recognise in the point that you make, Mr Mason, around anchor tenants, we have looked at, you know, for example, the building assessment reports that we would require public sector potential anchor tenants to undertake as a means of identifying are there larger kind of, and we've seen, for example, in Glenrothes, the important role that Fife Council is playing in delivery of that project, which is originally Fife House and some other key premises in Fife Council operate, including a leisure centre and a care home, being connected up to the network, and that's provided, you know, the investor certainty, the demand load onto the network, and hopefully it will grow from there into residential areas and to other business premises. So the point you make is absolutely critical in terms of making a viable case for a network investment at a local level. So we're trying to look at how we can work with the public sector initially around you know, having to undertake the building assessment report to inform that decision as to whether it would be a sensible thing or not to connect up to a heat network. When it comes to individual consumers, we obviously have also not just the ECHR aspects, but also the reserve powers as well. As I think the most likely landing point is that there will be a GB-wide consumer protection framework that we have a role in appointing a licensing authority to oversee in Scotland. And to take on that responsibility. There are obviously some interactions with reserved legislation as well. So it does make it difficult in terms of points around standing charges and various other issues there that you mentioned, but perhaps I can invite James and indeed colleagues online to comment on that.
Yeah, so I guess this has been the major issue that we've really kind of grappled with, I guess internally and with our working group and other stakeholders. And I would probably hasten to add that it's not just the developers that have advocated for this. To be fair, we've seen some comment and support from public sector organisations as well. It's probably just worth mentioning for balance. That said, the working group that we ran last year, they couldn't come to a consensus on exactly how they would recommend to us that you deal with this issue of demand risk to create the demand needed to make the business case stack up. If I can give you a few examples that we heard. Suggestions included that heat networks be given kind of sole right to operate a network within a certain zone. That Scottish planning policy more strongly encouraged connection to heat networks for new buildings. The public sector considers the total life cycle costs of heating systems to support the commercial case for heat networks when it's considering how it's going to use its buildings in future. So there's a kind of range of stuff there, and it seems that there's a range of opinions on this, but I would say probably, certainly in part 4 in terms of permits, probably delivered on at least one of those asks of the working group. And as the Minister said, part 6 of the bill also provides these network wayleave rights, which I guess in practice could be useful where if you can establish that connection, then there's a real opportunity when there's a change of tenure or where an existing heating system needs to be replaced, that heat network provider can really kind of properly engage with the building owner and hopefully come to some sort of commercial agreement for the offtake of heat there. Or maybe my colleague on the line, Ursula, can maybe talk more about the kind of European aspects of that. But I guess we would also point to the fact that we've got NPF4 coming up. We've got the existing powers. We've got an existing commitment to non-domestic rates relief out to 2032 coming as well. And there's new powers under the Non-Domestic Rates Act of 2020 as well that could be employed. So I guess there's a both within the bill and then outside of the bill as well. There are hopefully a lot of potential ways that we can keep looking at this. But I'll let maybe if my colleague could speak on the European aspect.
Yes. Which colleague?
Sure. If Ursula could perhaps address that, convener.
Sorry, unfortunately I'm not catching what either of you are saying. Okay, Ms. Kasparek, please.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much, convener. So we have looked at the different European examples of the mandatory connection, and in fact we have examined the Danish model quite closely because we were told that this is something that worked over the years, and in fact, that works on the basis of a compulsory standing charge that even though you are not using a heat network, you still need to pay a standing charge to contribute to this communal solution and communal infrastructure. We have looked at this, but it sort of brings a lot of different complex questions as to whether it's fair to give that additional charges when we are already talking here quite a lot about fuel poverty and how we can manage this challenge where we do not have those consumer protections that we can provide just now through the bill. And there was an example in some of the German municipalities where there was a mandatory connection, but there wasn't consumer protection, and that led to some significant challenges for consumers. So we really wanted to avoid a situation where we are mandating someone to connect, but we are unable to protect them sufficiently. Another examples from, I believe, Norway, where when the planning system was used, and as James mentioned previously, that could be done outside of the bill through existing legislation. So there are different options, but none of them was a perfect match for us. And as it was outlined previously, all of them are carrying some risks with them.
Thanks so much.
All right, thank you. Now Alison Harris.
Minister. I would like to explore a bit about multiple parties. How will projects where there are actually multiple parties be regulated? You know, for example, Scottish Water in Stirling. Will there be a degree of flexibility in the consents and regulatory frameworks to accommodate projects of this nature?
If I can, all the difficult questions, duck them to James. If I can perhaps bring in James Hempel, convener, with your permission, to address Ms Harris's point.
I might defer in turn to my colleague Ursula, but I guess just initially, I think I guess our starting point is that the regulation applies to the kind of licensed party, and I guess subsequent to that, we would expect that you know, those obligations would apply to any subcontractors, and the licence holder, for example, would be held accountable for the subsequent actions of any, and the need for that subcontractor to meet those obligations. But maybe my colleague Ursula Casbrett might be best to comment on that.
Can we bring in...
Thank you very much, Convener.
Yes.
So the example of Stirling that I think was given in one of the evidence sessions was where the Scottish Water Horizons are operating the energy centre, and the Stirling Council is responsible for the supply of the heat to the properties. And that is quite a common model where you would have a party that is responsible for heat generation, and then there is another party that, for example, is responsible for moving the water around, and they are monitoring the business. As James outlined, we would be licensing one major party, and that party, as is set out in the bill, would be the one responsible for supply of heat. So we would just then need to make sure that any subsequent parties that are involved in this heat network have to comply with the conditions of the license, and that would be responsibility of the licensee to oversee it. So we don't want to hinder any business models because they are evolving, and as we said previously, this is an emerging market and there will be different models, some of which involve a heat network which is fully vertically integrated, even with a production of a fuel, if it's a biomass boiler, for example. So we don't want to hinder that if that's the most efficient way of delivering heat. But we are also recognizing that where there are multiple parties, has to be a party that is sort of a responsible party, and it has to then subsequently be bound by conditions, and all the contractors will then have to be bound by conditions as well. So I hope that answers the question.
I ask, how can the interests of the consumer be best represented and enforced in projects where there is no single responsible party then?
Well, I think as has been outlined in an example in Stirling, obviously we have, as James has alluded to, with single licence holder, potentially subcontractors, they're obviously bound by the conditions of their licence, and if they were failing to deliver on the conditions of their licence, including obviously how they act responsibly in relation to consumers, then that would be potentially a territory where the licensing authority would have to take action against ultimately the potential ultimate sanction of revocation of a licence, which is subject to appeal, of course, if there was a failure to protect the interests of consumers. Obviously, we are slightly in the dark. We know the general direction that UK government's going with regard to consumer protection framework that would apply across GB, and we're comfortable with the general thrust of what's being provided there. We'll see the devil's in the detail, as with any legislation, of course. But hopefully there will be a sound underpinning in terms of consumer protection framework, plus the role of the licensing authority and enforcement authority in ensuring that the conditions of the licence are met. So I don't know whether that, kind of in a single bullet kind of addresses the point that that Ms Harris is making, but hopefully it gives confidence that there is obviously the ability, as James was outlining, where there's multiple parties involved with through a single licence. Ultimately, the top tier, if you like, of that the project is responsible for those working underneath. That there would be protection there, but I don't know whether I think James would want to add to that.
It's probably maybe worth mentioning as well that when we come to specific sites, we obligations could be attached to the heat network consent, and if there was maybe a change in kind of the consent holder or the person with primary responsibility for that site and that consent, then that consent would transfer to those to the subsequent person, as with the obligations attached to that. Maybe just also worth mentioning with the consumer advocacy powers that we have devolved to us in 2016. Potentially there could be a role there in terms of using those powers, I guess, to dig into this a little bit more. If we do start to see more schemes that move away from this kind of vertically integrated model, and it becomes a little less clear for consumers, exactly who they're speaking to or how they get their voices heard, and potentially there could be something there that we could look at.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Now the Deputy Convener, who joins us remotely.
Thanks very much, Convener. I wonder if I could ask the Minister about one of the more exciting parts of the bill, and that's about building assessment reports. That part of the bill, Minister, is about local authorities assessing the viability of connecting their existing buildings to heat networks. Does this mean, could you clarify, does this mean that it's only public buildings that will be covered? What about privately owned buildings or community owned buildings? Are they going to be within scope of the bill?
I haven't heard this section described as exciting before, so that's very positive indeed from Mr. Coffey. But yeah, we have indeed, we place a duty initially on public sector building owners to undertake an assessment of the viability of their buildings to connect to a heat network, and obviously with the aim to ensure sufficient and reliable data is available to identify and sustain robust heat networks, network zones. And the reason for the initial focus on public sector buildings rather than on public, private and community buildings, as Mr. Coffey has said, is twofold. Firstly, the volume of public sector buildings, which we estimate there are around 20,000 across Scotland. Not only will this create a substantial data source, but it will help public sector building owners to identify whether connection to a low carbon heat network is an option to help compliance with their own duties under the Climate Change Scotland Act. Secondly, public sector buildings are considered by the sector to be optimal buildings around which to anchor a heat network. I referenced this point earlier on in response to, I think, Mr. Mason. That's because they're usually secure and they're long-term building owners or tenants, and that they often have substantial and very predictable demand for heat as well, which helps with the modelling for the heat network. And this gives greater confidence that heat will be used and when it will be used, enabling networks to be efficiently designed in turn. The bill provides for the duty to be extended further to other non-domestic buildings should heat networks find it challenging to identify other suitable anchor loads through commercial negotiations, which obviously at the present, if we're just focusing on building assessment reports for public buildings, there would be probably a need for just negotiation between heat network developers and locally non-domestic commercial building owners. But there is the power potentially to extend it. And given the current economic and financial challenges facing business in Scotland at this time, we've taken the view that care must be taken not to add to this burden at this moment in time, but there is scope to do so in future should it prove necessary. And currently, under the Assessment of Energy Performance of Non-Domestic Buildings Scotland regulations, owners of larger non-domestic buildings over 1,000 square metres are required to undertake an assessment of the energy performance when the property is sold or rented to a new tenant, which contains much of the information that would be required should building assessment reports be extended to them. So hopefully it wouldn't be too onerous for those building owners to take on that responsibility should we choose at some point in the future to extend it to them.
Thank you very much for that. That was very thorough, Paul. Thank you for that. Could I ask another question, please, about energy performance certificates? These have been in place for quite a number of years now, probably from 2007 onwards. What exactly will be in a building assessment report that isn't already in an energy performance certificate report? So how do we strengthen one when we've already got something that's pretty similar?
If I may, Convener, with your permission, just ask James and Ursula to maybe address that point in terms of the content of what's different between the EPC and the building assessment reports.
Yes, I appreciate that the energy performance certificates have come up quite a few times in evidence that the committee's heard today. But it's maybe just worth us clarifying that there's certainly nothing within the bill or the policy memorandum that sets out that we will be using or relying on EPCs as part of the building assessment report methodology. It's maybe worth updating that I guess the methodology for determining how you undertake this building assessment report. Our colleagues at Zero Waste Scotland are currently developing that methodology for us. Yes, with the Minister's agreement, I'm sure we'll be happy to provide that to the committee in due course. But I guess just to give you a bit of an early indication, we don't expect this to be a kind of resource-intensive exercise. We envisage that it's the role or the content of a building assessment report. We envisage it would be done by like a building manager or facilities manager, and it would contain things that are fairly readily available to those people, such as their heating bill and through their climate change reporting duties. So things such as their annual energy consumption, whether the building uses a kind of wet system like radiators and things like that. These are kind of important factors for the developer to know, to understand how efficiently a building can be retrofitted and how the costs of that.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Jane. I wonder if I could just ask a final question to the Minister, please. Convener Paul, earlier on, I think you said that about 81% of premises, residential premises, I think, depend on gas central heating systems at the moment. And the report that we got in from Denmark there, which I haven't had a chance to read all of it, but it seemed to suggest that 2/3 of all of their households are connected to district heating systems. It's quite a catch-up journey that we're on in Scotland, isn't it? And are you confident that we can close a gap like that? And how soon do you think we might get there?
It's a very good point. I think probably would say, and based on the discussions we've had with colleagues from Denmark and the evidence of what they've achieved there, I think a large part of the kind of surge in heat network being established across Denmark happened in the mid 70s onwards, as I mentioned earlier on, in terms of using natural gas as a fuel to effectively remove the responsibility for having an individual boiler in someone's premises and create a heat network, but with a very low cost fuel. And so it's probably a big reason for why Denmark in particular has rocketed ahead in terms of the percentage of premises that are covered by heat networks. They then migrated those systems over to renewable fuels such as biomass and other sources over time. We're going to have to try and do this in a different way, in a different era, and without the advantage of having a very cheap, indeed very cheap initially source of fuel to do that in terms of form of natural gas. And so that will be a challenge for us. There's various estimates, I think, that both James and myself referred to earlier on, a range of between 17 and 17%. It doesn't sound very high in comparison to Denmark, but reflects our rurality, the nature of the kind of communities in which it's felt that local heat networks might actually provide a viable and competitive alternative heating system. I would hope in practice we might be able to overachieve on those figures. Clearly, if we identify through local heat and energy efficiency strategies that there is a larger share of Scotland's communities, which is, a heat network would be a viable and indeed attractive opportunity for communities to get ideally renewable heat, then I would be, as a minister or my successors, I'm sure would be absolutely enthusiastic about pursuing that. So, but what we're trying to do is be realistic in terms of the range that we provided. We've provided costings and the benefits based on midpoint of that range at around 12%. And hopefully we can overachieve on that in practice. But as you rightly say, Mr. Coffey, what Denmark's achieved is extremely impressive. But they've had the benefit, I think, of going through using fossil fuels to help make them cost competitive to start with. And that's something that we don't really have in the context of climate emergency available to us. But who knows where we can go with hydrogen potentially being an attractive opportunity. That may provide us with a useful fuel going forward, and that's something that clearly we're going to look at in the context of our wider heat decarbonisation, the role of hydrogen and other biogases, for example, in providing alternatives. I hope that's helpful to Mr.
Okay,
Coffey.
thanks very much. Yeah, it certainly is. Thank you for that, Paul. Thanks. Back to you, convener.
Andy Whiteman.
Thanks very much, convener. So there's been quite a bit of discussion about Denmark, and I just want to open with some questions about governance, because in the Delegated Powers report says you have 45 regulation-making powers in this bill. In total, there's somewhere in the region of 60 to 70 ministerial powers in this bill, and that includes the important ministerial powers of licensing and consenting. By contrast, local authorities have got 5. Now, the Minister's mentioned Denmark. Denmark's got 98 municipalities who are the heat planning authority. Why is there such a contrast between Denmark and Scotland in relationship to the degree of decentralisation that's being proposed?
Well, I suppose I should set out from the outset, we've not aimed to take a radically different approach from Denmark in that respect. So, we've landed where we have, based on the working of the working group and the heat networks working group as well, in terms of the consensus around the kind of powers that are needed and the distribution of them. We do rely heavily on delegated powers. Mr. Whiteman is right to identify that. That is something we expect potentially a couple of years' worth of work through the Delegated Powers Committee to address. And that reflects the bill is regulating a market from scratch, effectively, and we are trying to create obviously in as simple a way as we can, the appropriate framework for developing a regulated market. We look to other markets, particularly utilities such as gas, electricity and water, and we see that those regulatory systems have developed over a number of years and through multiple pieces of legislation, and we haven't got that luxury here. We're trying to do it, as I say, from scratch. And we're dealing with a complex technology, or technologies, plural. Our view is the flexibility is needed to adapt the regulatory regime over time, and the market technology matures as the market and technology matures in Scotland. And that can only be achieved through the creation of powers in primary legislation as part of this bill, with detailed regulations determined through secondary legislation. So, certainly from the point of view of the response from the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee, as I understand it, they had raised only one question with us on the use of delegated powers in the bill and seemed comfortable with that. In terms of the balance, obviously we have happy to engage and see the committee's recommendations around the balance of responsibilities between Scottish ministers and local authorities. I do recognise the point that Mr Whiteman is making about where the balance. I haven't totted them up in that way, but I can recognise that he's probably right in his assessment of where the balance lies. If there are, obviously in response to Ms Grant and others, we've tried to set out how we would want to engage with local authorities and local communities, and trying to create a consistency of approach across Scotland. The possibility heat networks may go across local authority boundaries as well. There's a number of different permutations, particularly around suburban areas and urban settlements. And we have struck the balance we have, but clearly if the committee feels that the balance is wrong, then it would obviously be keen to hear from the committee. I don't know whether this is something that James can comment on in terms of comparisons with what's been taken forward elsewhere in the countries that Mr Whiteman mentioned.
Yeah, I suppose Norway is another example that we've looked at, and at least initially Norway started with a more government or essentially led approach, and I think gradually over time the responsibility for the system devolved to local authorities. I guess the bill allows for the regulations to change the enforcement authority from the Scottish ministers to another person. So I guess the door's not closed to that over time, I suppose.
Thanks. And also in Denmark, the heat distribution network is owned predominantly by municipalities and co-ops, consumer co-ops, and there's also a legal not-for-profit requirement in operating the network. Again, this looks like a very centralised model, ministers consenting, large multinational corporates coming in. Was there any consideration to imposing a not-for-profit rule on the operation of heat networks?
I would maybe ask James to comment on that in terms of the work of the working group as to whether that was looked at. I would want to stress, though, in terms of, I wouldn't necessarily agree with Mr Whiteman's characterisation of the potential investors. Yes, there may well be larger investors, and I would be surprised if there isn't interest with the environment we're creating from even outside Scotland in terms of larger corporates wanting to come in. But we've also created the space for potentially community-led projects to be taken forward, and indeed we've considered potentially some ways in which we could support community projects in terms of either there's potentially administrator's discretion to not require certain costs in terms of the licensing costs and the application costs to be offset for community-owned projects. So we are looking at how we can encourage a diversity of ownership, and we're aware that in Scotland there would potentially be a larger number of small networks that we clearly want to see properly regulated. But indeed, in our engagement with UK ministers, we're very keen to ensure that any consumer protection framework is reflective of the nature of these smaller, potentially even island projects that might have to be delivered in Scotland, make sure that the regulations and the frameworks are proportionate, so they're not applying the same rules to potentially in those circumstances to a large corporate that we would to a smaller locally led project that's struggling to make the project viable. So we are trying to get the balance right here, and certainly we welcome the thoughts of the committee in respect of these aspects of the bill, but we're certainly not going at it purely from a point of view of attracting large sort of multinational type investors, which I think was certain part of the thrust of what Mr Whiteman was saying.
My question is, Denmark operates its municipalities and consumer co-ops operates heat networks almost exclusively.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously potential. I would hope that there may be some local authorities be interested in running their own heat networks, and that's indeed in no circumstances the powers for Scottish ministers to be the consenting authority could be helpful, because that creates obviously the ability for the project to be brought forward on an objective basis without any conflicts of interest. So, but I'd certainly be enthusiastic about local authorities that want to bring forward projects to agree with Mr Whiteman in that respect. We haven't, however, ruled out larger investors coming in, which I think is the point that maybe Mr Whiteman's looking for.
Okay, moving on to part 6 of the bill around compulsory purchase and wayleave rights. Did I catch the Minister correctly earlier when he said that Professor Paisley had welcomed the approach taken in part 6?
I think I was specifically referencing the transfer scheme that when I mentioned Professor Paisley.
We have had evidence from Professor Paisley, which no doubt the Minister has seen, in which he criticises, for example, Section 58 as being oddly drafted, and that it doesn't confer the primary right to transfer thermal energy. He's critical of the fact that there's no positive prescription powers there in the bill. He's critical that the wayleaves are not being created as real rights in law, bringing everything that a real right does. He considers that Section 60 particularly is poorly drafted, referring, for example, he says, to parties bound by the wayleave right as the owner and occupier. He says that's English-inspired nonsense. Can the Minister assure us that he's going to take these observations from Scotland's preeminent expert on the law of wayleaves and servitudes seriously? Because obviously when you're putting a lot of pipes underground, all sorts of legal complexities could arise, and it's really important to know who's got what rights. And central to his criticism seems to be the fact that the bill creates a novel framework for doing this, when in fact the existing system of servitudes and real rights and positive prescription is well tested, well understood, and gives far greater certainty.
Certainly, I'm very aware of the value of Professor Paisley's evidence to the committee, and I know he has, as Mr Whiteman has outlined, a number of areas around creation of real rights, as he put it, so that they run with the land, I think is the term he used, and bind successive landowners, given the long-term nature of these heat networks, which may take anything between 15 and 40 years to recover the investment costs for networks. So they are unusually long-term investments in that respect, not unlike large-scale sort of wind sites or other major energy investments. The provisions in Part 6 largely follow those contained in electricity legislation and provide equivalent rights to those available to other utilities. And one difference is that network wayleave rights would bind any subsequent owners and tenants on the land. I am aware, as I say, of the evidence that Professor Paisley has provided, and we're open to discussions on this matter if the committee recommends that this area needs to be tightened up, especially if proposed changes would ensure the bill doesn't repeat any issues that are occurring in the utility sector at the moment. And I'm aware from broadband to electricity to other investments, there are occasionally real difficulties in delivering services to consumers where landowners put their feet down and don't allow that to happen. So following introduction, we have also been aware of the potential to augment this part of the bill to ensure the rights are recorded transparently and are accessible, which is something that Professor Paisley obviously has alluded to in his own evidence, and we'd be happy to consider how this is best done alongside the committee. So we're open to suggestions from the committee on this point. And hope that's helpful to Mr Whiteman.
Okay, thanks. That is helpful. I just want to follow up just with a few sort of detailed questions that have arisen from comments that have been made. And first of all, a question arose from a response that Ms Kasparek gave a minute ago in relationship to the Stirling Horizons project. Section 2.1 of the bill says that a person must not supply thermal energy by means of a heat network unless the person holds a heat networks licence, and it's an offence to do otherwise. My understanding from that language is the person who's supplying is the person who's delivering it to the householder. Is that not the case?
Yes, so that is the case indeed. So that is the organisation that is responsible for transferring the heat. But in terms of the Scottish Horizons, that is so they are operating the heat generation as far as I'm concerned. So they are making sure that the water is warmed up. But as far as I'm aware, in terms of the legal responsibilities, it is the Stirling Council that is legally responsible for delivery of the thermal energy. So the pumps may be in the energy centre, but the legal responsibility for delivery will be with the Stirling Council. But
Okay, we seem to have lost Ms Kasparek, but a question arises. We have Mr MacLeod. I don't know if he wants to say anything.
Well, only to observe that each individual particular setup will have its own managerial or company structure, and I'm not sure it's possible to delve into these in this level of detail here. I think the general proposition that Mr Wyman's making is correct, that it's the legal entity that's responsible for supply that has to be licensed, and that the person operating the network has to have consent. But who that person is in an individual case would have to be based on a consideration of the management and legal structure of that particular heat network.
Yes, no, I understand that. I'm just concerned that we're clear about what Section 2.1 actually means. That I, as a householder, I'm in receipt of heat from a heat network. I pay someone for it. They are the supplier who requires the licence. And if that's clear in the minds of government, there's no ambiguity in that. That's absolutely fine. And going back to an earlier discussion we had about appeals, where I think Section 24, and there was, I think, a section 70 or so, we're talking about appeal rights that could be created by regulation, but they were in relationship to enforcement. I'm just wondering, in relation to section 11, which is about licence revocation, there are no appeal rights there. That seems to be rest wholly with the licence giver, and presumably those revocations would be based on a clear breach of the legal terms of the licence.
I think I may have been referencing actually the revocation of the appeals around revocation of licences earlier on in passing. I can obviously come back on detail of that to Mr Whiteman if it wasn't clear at the time. The complexity as such I was presenting, which may have been the source of confusion, was around the position where under current drafting and in advance of knowing exactly what is in UK legislation around consumer protection, we have created space for Scottish ministers to potentially be the enforcement authority. or alternatively to appoint some other body to be the enforcement authority. And so if there's a little, I can appreciate there's a little bit of confusion about the appeals mechanism, so we go into the discussion around the role of the courts, the court session, sheriff courts in that context, in the instance that there was a revocation licence and then there was in a subsequent appeal, who would that go to? And so we can obviously come back to the committee if it's helpful, just to try and make clear exactly what our expectations are around revocation of a licence and the appeal mechanism, and how that might be different if we get the clarity that we're seeking from UK ministers around the appointment of licensing authority and other measures.
Thanks. Yes, I was just a bit confused. And finally, if I may, just convener, the question of transfers of transfer schemes under Section 74. What transfer of assets? What if no one's willing to take on an asset? What happens to them? And a sort of sub-question of that would be, what about decommissioning of schemes? But if you could address the question, first of all, if no one's willing to take on an asset owned by an entity that has gone bust or for other reasons can't operate.
Well, ultimately, I'll check with James a second if I've got this correct in terms of my interpretation. There's obviously powers for ministers to step in and to take on responsibility for that heat network in that such situation. Clearly, we would hope that if we've gone through the process properly, these are new networks that have been established under the LHEs, the zoning for heat networks, that we've identified that this is a competitive technology in that locality that's providing, a good outcome. So it's an appropriate use of the technology in the area. And a well-designed scheme, then there should be clearly a strong market underpinning for that particular network, and to allow someone else to take on responsibility for that network. To answer Mr Whiteman, I'll just double check with James I've got this correct. Scottish ministers, ultimately, if there's no commercial interest in that site, could step in, take on responsibility for it until such time as an alternative provider can take on responsibility. But just confirm with Mr.
That's correct, yep.
I don't see that in Section 74, and the Minister earlier talked about a contrast with the UK approach where there were step-in powers, and there's not going to be step-in powers here, so I'm a bit confused.
Well, it's more a case, I think, of cause confusion in that respect, is that we're obviously awaiting the detail of what step-in powers we can will specify, because they may have a role, as we discussed about Mr Golden, around existing heat networks as well. So it's just to understand how we're interacting with Section 7, Part 7 of our bill, and the relative interaction between the two pieces of legislation. I hope I'm misled Mr Whiteman in that respect. We obviously have set out our own transfer schemes under Part 7 of the bill, which potentially could have Scottish ministers, as I say, stepping in to take over responsibility of the network, should there be no commercial interest in it.
Okay, I'm not sure, Convener, if broadcasting was broadcasting the early part of that answer, and therefore the official report will not have captured it. Well, would it be appropriate to ask the Minister to repeat it briefly?
Which part precisely, just so we don't
it was about. I asked the question as to, because the Minister earlier had said that the UK were taking an approach about step-in powers, whereby Minister's government would step in as last resort, whereas the Scottish Government were not taking that approach. And I was just querying the fact that in answering my question about who would ultimately own these assets if there wasn't anyone willing to take on, the Minister had said we weren't going to take a step in.
Yeah, I mean, just to repeat the point, I hope I haven't caused any confusion. I may have done, and so apologies to Mr Whiteman if I have. We're aware, obviously, the UK government's proposing to take forward its legislation early part of next year, which would set out its step-in powers, which would certainly have, in response to Mr Golden's point earlier on, have the ability to provide for a situation where an existing network failed. We just need to understand how that interacts with Part 7 of our bill, where we've set out transfer schemes, which could include Scottish ministers taking over responsibility for a heat network in a similar situation for a new network, for example. So it's just to understand the interaction between the two pieces of legislation. So it's not a fundamentally different approach UK ministers taking. It was different legislation, and therefore we just need to understand that the interaction between the two.
And given this bill is going to be if it passes at stage 1, will be enacted before the UK government Parliament's bill, I'm presuming therefore that the regulations under 74.5 will enable you to make those necessary adjustments and adaptations to anything that arises at UK level.
I'll just check on that point with James, if I may, Convener. But certainly in terms of the timing of the bill, hopefully we will have sufficient foresight with collaboration with Bay's ministers and their officials about what they are proposing to put in the bill. It could, of course, be amended as it passes through the House of Commons. I appreciate that point. But we'll do as much as we can to try and design out any risks that that could undermine our own legislation. But if we can just, on the section 74 point, just hand over to...
Yeah, that's correct. I guess the powers there have been left relatively broad to enable us to I guess, as the Minister said, understand how this interacts with what the UK government intends to do in future. Can I just clarify the earlier point in terms of the obligation on the Scottish ministers to step in? I'll clarify where that is set out, but it is set out. Apologies, I just don't have the section number to hand.
Okay, thanks, Convener.
All right, thank you very much to the Minister and his team for coming in today. I'll suspend the meeting and we'll move straight into private session. Thank you.